Blood stained the sands of Hattin. The scorching sun of July 1187 beat down mercilessly as thousands of armoured knights collapsed under the weight of their steel, their throats raw with thirst, their lines broken by exhaustion. The Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, the most powerful Crusader state in the Holy Land, was being annihilated. King Guy de Lusignan watched in horror as his cavalry shattered against wave after wave of Muslim horsemen. The Holy Cross itself, the most sacred relic of Christendom, fell into enemy hands. This was not luck. This was not chance. This was the culmination of a master plan forged over decades by one man. A Kurdish boy who grew up in the shadows of Damascus would become the Sultan who united a fractured Islamic world. A soldier who started his career reluctantly would become the general who destroyed the mightiest army the Crusaders could muster. A leader who showed mercy to his enemies would become the conqueror who reclaimed Jerusalem after 88 years of Christian occupation. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. History knows him as Saladin. The Christians called him the greatest enemy they ever faced. The Muslims called him the defender of the faith. Both sides agreed on one thing: he was the most formidable warrior of the medieval age. This is the story of how one man rose from obscurity to reshape the destiny of the Middle East, how he orchestrated the greatest military victory of the Crusades era, and how he captured the holiest city in the world without spilling rivers of blood in vengeance. If you're ready to witness the brutal truth of medieval warfare and discover how Saladin became the legend who crushed the Crusader dream, then smash that like button right now and subscribe to Wars in History. Ring that notification bell because you don't want to miss a single moment of this epic story. The year was 1137 or 1138 in the town of Tikrit, along the banks of the Tigris River in what is now Iraq. On an unremarkable night, a Kurdish family welcomed their son into the world, Yusuf, third of 8 children. His father, Najm al-Din Ayyub, was a governor serving the powerful Turkish warlord Imad al-Din Zangi, who controlled northern Syria. That very night, Najm al-Din gathered his entire family and fled to Aleppo, abandoning his position to enter Zangi's service directly. The baby born into this chaos of midnight flight and uncertain future was named Yusuf. He would grow up to earn the title Salah ad-Din, meaning righteousness of the faith. The world young Yusuf entered was one of devastating fracture and religious warfare. The First Crusade had torn through the Middle East like a blade through flesh 4 decades earlier. In 1099, European knights had stormed Jerusalem, massacring tens of thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in rivers of blood that flowed through the streets for days. They established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and 3 other Crusader states, carving out Christian territories in lands that had been Muslim for over 4 centuries. The Islamic world, already divided between rival caliphates and competing dynasties, reeled from the shock. The Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad held spiritual authority but little actual power. The Shia Fatimid Caliphate controlled Egypt and claimed its own religious supremacy. Syria and Mesopotamia were fragmented into dozens of competing Muslim kingdoms, each more concerned with their own survival than with the foreign invaders occupying the holy sites of Islam. Growing up in Baalbek and later in Damascus, Saladin was an unexceptional youth by all accounts. While his father and uncle climbed the ranks of military and political power under successive Turkish rulers, young Yusuf showed more interest in religious studies than in swordsmanship. He studied the Quran and Islamic sciences with dedication, absorbing the principles of faith that would later define his leadership. Damascus, under Nur al-Din, who had succeeded Zangi as the most powerful Muslim ruler in Syria, was a city alive with the rhetoric of jihad and counter-crusade. The concept of holy war to reclaim lost Muslim territories permeated every aspect of life, and young Saladin absorbed these ideals even as he appeared destined for a quiet life as a scholar or administrator rather than a warrior. Everything changed in 1164 when Saladin's uncle, Asad al-Din Shirkuh, a trusted general of Nur al-Din, was ordered to lead a military expedition into Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate was collapsing into chaos, torn apart by internal power struggles between rival viziers. Both Nur al-Din and the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem recognized that whoever controlled Egypt would control the wealth and resources to dominate the entire region. Shirkuh needed officers he could trust absolutely, and he pressed his reluctant nephew Yusuf into service. At 26 years old, Saladin began his military career not out of ambition or bloodlust, but out of family obligation. He would later admit that he entered military service unwillingly, dragged along by his uncle's insistence. The Egyptian campaigns were brutal proving grounds. Between 1164 and 1169, Shirkuh led 3 separate military expeditions into Egypt, each time facing opposition from both Fatimid Egyptian forces and Crusader armies sent from Jerusalem to counter Syrian influence. Saladin fought in desperate battles, learned siege warfare, mastered cavalry tactics, and witnessed the political treachery that defined Middle Eastern warfare. He saw how fragile alliances were, how quickly supposed allies could become enemies, how gold and promises meant nothing without the strength to enforce them. In 1169, during the Third Egyptian Campaign, Shirkuh finally triumphed and was appointed vizier, the chief minister of the Fatimid Caliph. But Shirkuh was old and exhausted. 2 months after achieving his greatest success, he died suddenly. The crisis of succession was immediate. Who would control the Syrian army now occupying Egypt? Who would serve as vizier to a teenage Fatimid caliph? The political situation was explosive. Saladin was only 31 years old, relatively unknown, and facing opposition from older, more experienced commanders who resented his rapid elevation. But his family connections, his proven loyalty, and his emerging political skills won the day. Against all odds, Saladin was appointed both commander of the Syrian troops in Egypt and vizier of the Fatimid Caliph. A Kurdish outsider suddenly held the reins of power in one of the wealthiest and most strategically vital territories in the Islamic world. What Saladin did next revealed the political genius that would define his career. He moved with ruthless efficiency to consolidate his position. He ordered the assassination of Shawar, the previous vizier whose treachery had prolonged the Egyptian conflict. He suppressed a dangerous revolt by Nubian infantry regiments, loyal to the old Fatimid order, crushing the rebellion with decisive force. He installed his kinsmen, brothers, cousins, and loyal Kurdish officers into every key military and administrative position, creating a network of family power that could not be easily dislodged. He fortified Alexandria against potential invasion, strengthened Cairo's defences, and reorganized the Egyptian army. He won public support by abolishing unpopular taxes that had burdened the Egyptian population under the decaying Fatimid administration. When a combined Sicilian-Byzantine fleet appeared off the coast in 1169 intent on invading Egypt, Saladin's rapid military response and show of strength forced them to abandon the attempt without a battle. 2 years after becoming vizier in 1171, the Fatimid Caliph died just before his 21st birthday. Saladin seized the moment that would define the future of the Islamic world. He abolished the Fatimid Caliphate entirely, ending 262 years of Shia rule over Egypt. In its place, he restored recognition of the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad as the spiritual authority for Egyptian Muslims. This was more than a political maneuver. It was a revolutionary transformation. Saladin, a Kurdish soldier, had led a Sunni Syrian army to conquer Shia Egypt, and then systematically dismantled one of the most powerful dynasties in Islamic history. He established his own dynasty, the Ayyubid dynasty, named after his father. At 33 years old, Saladin had gone from reluctant soldier to Sultan of Egypt, controlling vast wealth, commanding a powerful army, and positioning himself as a champion of Sunni orthodoxy and Islamic unity. But Egypt was only the beginning. Saladin understood that to truly challenge the Crusader States, to reclaim Jerusalem, to fulfill the dream of jihad that consumed the Muslim world, he needed far more than Egypt. He needed Syria. He needed Mesopotamia. He needed to unite the fractured Muslim territories under a single banner, and that meant confronting his former master. Nur al-Din, the Syrian ruler who had sent Saladin's uncle to Egypt in the first place, now looked upon his vassal's success with growing suspicion and jealousy. Nur al-Din demanded that Saladin invade the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem immediately. Saladin, understanding his position was not yet secure, delayed and made excuses. The tension between master and servant escalated to the brink of war. Nur al-Din prepared to invade Egypt to bring his rebellious subordinate to heel. Saladin prepared to defend his new kingdom against his former lord. And then, in 1174, Nur al-Din died suddenly at the age of 56. The great Syrian ruler's death threw the entire political landscape into chaos. His heir was a child, and his empire immediately began fracturing as governors, generals, and princes competed for power. Saladin saw his opportunity. The reluctant soldier who'd been pressed into service a decade earlier, the outsider who had risen to command Egypt through family connections and ruthless pragmatism, now stood at the threshold of his greatest gambit. He would not simply defend Egypt. He would conquer Syria. He would unite the Muslim world. He would become the leader the Islamic world had been waiting for since the First Crusade had traumatized an entire civilization 75 years earlier. The stage was set. The man was ready. And the Crusaders, secure in their castles and confident in their military supremacy, had no idea what was coming. The dawn broke over Damascus on October 28, 1174, and the city gates swung open not to an invading army but to a saviour. Saladin entered with only 700 hand-picked cavalry, and the streets erupted in celebration. The people had suffered under weak leadership, watched helplessly as Crusader armies threatened their borders, and feared the greedy ambitions of distant warlords who cared nothing for their safety. Now a man had come who promised strength, who spoke of unity, who radiated the confidence of someone who had conquered Egypt and survived assassination attempts. Within 10 days of his arrival, Saladin left his brother Tughtagin as governor and departed to begin the most audacious campaign of his life, the unification of a fractured Muslim world. But the road to this moment had been forged through years of brutal apprenticeship in the killing fields of Egypt. When Saladin's uncle Shirkuh first dragged him on that expedition to Egypt in 1164, the young man had no military experience, no battlefield glory, no reputation beyond being the nephew of a trusted general. The first Egyptian campaign was a baptism by fire. Shirkuh's army of several thousand Kurdish and Turkish cavalry faced not only the treacherous vizier Shawar and his Egyptian forces, but also Amalric the Fool, the aggressive king of Jerusalem who recognized that Egypt's wealth was the prize that would determine the future of the region. During that first campaign, Saladin learned lessons that would define his military career. He witnessed how Shirkuh maneuvered his smaller force to avoid being trapped by the combined armies of Shawar and Amalric. He saw how speed and mobility could compensate for inferior numbers. He learned that in the desert warfare of Egypt, water sources determined strategy as much as troop dispositions. When Shirkuh was forced to negotiate a withdrawal after months of inconclusive maneuvering, Saladin absorbed the bitter truth that military campaigns were as much about logistics, supplies, and political calculation as about battlefield courage. The Second Egyptian Campaign in 1167 transformed Saladin from observer to commander. Shirkuh invaded Egypt again with Nur al-Din's backing, determined to install a regime favourable to Syrian interests. This time, when the combined forces of Amalric and Shawar cornered Shirkuh's army, the Turkish general made a desperate gamble. He split his forces, sending his main army south while leaving Saladin with a small detachment to occupy and defend Alexandria. At 29 years old, Saladin found himself responsible for holding one of the most important cities in the Mediterranean world against a siege by battle-hardened Crusader knights and Egyptian troops who vastly outnumbered his garrison. The 75-day siege of Alexandria became the crucible that forged Saladin's reputation. He had approximately 1,000 Syrian cavalry and a few hundred infantry to defend a city whose population was uncertain in their loyalty. Many Alexandrians were sympathetic to Shawar, who had ruled Egypt before Shirkuh's invasions. Others simply wanted to avoid the destruction that a prolonged siege would bring. Saladin faced not only military pressure from outside the walls, but potential betrayal from within. He organised the defence with meticulous care, personally inspecting the walls daily, ensuring supplies were rationed fairly, and using his charm and persuasive abilities to win over key figures in the city's leadership. Crusader siege engines battered the walls and enemy troops assaulted the breaches. Saladin was always at the critical point, rallying defenders and leading counterattacks. The siege might have ended in disaster had Shirkuh's campaign in southern Egypt not succeeded in pressuring Shawar to negotiate. When a truce was finally arranged and Saladin was allowed to evacuate Alexandria with his garrison intact, his reputation had been transformed. The reluctant soldier who had been pressed into service by family obligation had proven himself as a commander who could hold an impossible position through skill, courage, and force of personality. Nur al-Din took note. Shirkuh recognized that his nephew was no longer just loyal family but a valuable military asset. The Third Egyptian Campaign in 1169 was the decisive one, and by now Saladin was one of Shirkuh's key lieutenants. This time, when Shirkuh's army entered Egypt, King Amalric's Crusader force retreated rather than face another prolonged conflict. Shawar's days were numbered. When Shirkuh was appointed vizier by the teenage Fatimid Caliph al-Adid, it seemed the Syrian takeover of Egypt was complete. But Shirkuh was already old and exhausted by years of campaigning in the brutal Egyptian heat. On March 23, 1169, just 2 months after achieving his greatest triumph, Shirkuh died suddenly. Some sources suggest a heart attack, others hint at less natural causes. What is certain is that his death created an immediate crisis of succession. The Syrian army in Egypt was a coalition of Kurdish tribal warriors loyal to Saladin's family, Turkish cavalry who had served Nur al-Din for years, and various mercenaries and opportunists who fought for whoever paid them. Older, more experienced commanders believed they deserved Shirkuh's position. The Fatimid court officials feared all Syrians equally, but hoped to install someone weak and controllable. Al-Adid, the 21-year-old caliph who was caliph in name only, had no real power but needed to appoint someone quickly before the Syrian army descended into factional warfare. Saladin's father Najm al-Din Ayyub, who was serving as an administrator in Damascus, reportedly wrote to his son with explicit instructions: "Seize power immediately, eliminate any rivals, and establish your authority before opposition could organize." Saladin moved with ruthless efficiency. He cultivated al-Adid personally, presenting himself as a humble servant of the caliph rather than a foreign conqueror. He distributed gifts and honors to key officers, buying their loyalty with promises of future rewards. He isolated and marginalized older commanders who opposed his elevation, stripping them of their troops through political maneuvering before they could mount serious resistance. Within weeks, Saladin had secured his appointment as both commander of the Syrian forces and vizier of Egypt. At 31 years old, he controlled the military power and administrative machinery of one of the wealthiest states in the Mediterranean world. But controlling Egypt on paper was very different from ruling it in reality. The Fatimid bureaucracy was filled with officials loyal to the old regime, who saw Saladin as a foreign usurper who had stolen power from their rightful rulers. The Fatimid army, particularly the elite Nubian regiments and the Armenian palace guards, despised the Syrian invaders who had pushed them aside. The Egyptian population, predominantly Sunni, but governed by a Shia dynasty for over 2 centuries, was uncertain whether this Kurdish general represented liberation or simply a new form of oppression. And in the background, Nur al-Din in Damascus watched his vassal's growing power with increasing suspicion, wondering if he had created a rival rather than a subordinate. Saladin's first major crisis came within months of taking power. In August 1169, a massive combined fleet of Byzantines and Crusaders from the Kingdom of Sicily appeared off the Egyptian coast, intent on capturing the vital port of Damietta. If Damietta fell, Egypt's maritime trade would be strangled, and Alexandria would be vulnerable to invasion. The attack was coordinated with internal conspiracies. Fatimid loyalists hoped to use the invasion as cover for a coup that would overthrow Saladin and restore the old regime's power. Saladin marched his army to Damietta and directed the defense personally. The siege lasted 50 days, with constant assaults on the walls and attempts by the attackers to break through the harbour defences. Saladin's forces held firm, and when autumn storms damaged the Byzantine fleet and supplies ran low, the invasion collapsed. The attackers withdrew in disarray, and Saladin's prestige soared. The victory at Damietta bought Saladin time, but the internal threat remained. In 1171, the now familiar pattern repeated. Fatimid military units and court officials conspired to assassinate Saladin and restore their former power. This time, Saladin's response was devastating and final. He arrested the ringleaders, executed them without trial, and then systematically purged the Fatimid military. The Armenian palace guards were disbanded. The Nubian infantry regiments were either incorporated into Saladin's army under the command of his own officers or expelled from Egypt entirely. Fatimid officials who could not prove their loyalty were removed from their positions and replaced with Saladin's family members, Kurdish kinsmen, or carefully vetted administrators who owed everything to him. Then came the revolutionary act that would define Saladin's historical significance. On September 10, 1171, when Caliph al-Adid lay dying in his palace, Saladin made the decision that would transform the religious and political landscape of the Middle East. He ordered that the Friday prayers in Cairo's mosques, which for 262 years had been said in the name of the Fatimid Shia Caliph, should now be said in the name of al-Mustadi, the Sunni Abbasid, Caliph in Baghdad. With that single command, Saladin abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, ended Shia rule over Egypt, and proclaimed himself the champion of Sunni orthodoxy. When al-Adid died a few days later, possibly from natural causes, though some chroniclers suspected poison, there was no successor. The dynasty that had ruled Egypt since 909 CE simply ceased to exist. The enormity of what Saladin had accomplished cannot be overstated. A Kurdish outsider, the nephew of a dead general, serving as vizier to a caliph he had just eliminated, had overthrown one of the most powerful dynasties in Islamic history and completely reoriented Egypt's religious and political allegiances. He established the Ayyubid dynasty, named after his father Ayyub, and positioned himself as the defender of Sunni Islam against both Shia heresy and Crusader invasion. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, delighted to have Egypt restored to Sunni orthodoxy and to gain such a powerful supporter, sent Saladin robes of honour and diplomas confirming his authority as Sultan of Egypt. But even as Saladin consolidated his control over Egypt, his relationship with Nur al-Din deteriorated into barely concealed hostility. Nur al-Din had sent Shakku to Egypt intending to create a Syrian puppet state that would serve Damascus's interests. Instead, his former subordinate now ruled independently, commanded vast wealth, and showed no inclination to obey orders. In 1171 and 1172, Nur al-Din repeatedly commanded Saladin to bring the Egyptian army north to join in campaigns against the Crusader kingdoms. Saladin repeatedly made excuses. The internal situation in Egypt was still unstable. His army was needed to defend against potential Byzantine invasions. Supplies were insufficient for a long campaign. These were reasonable arguments, but Nur al-Din understood the real reason. Saladin had no intention of leaving Egypt and placing himself back under his former master's direct control. The tension escalated throughout 1173 and into 1174. Nur al-Din began assembling an army in Damascus, and the word spread throughout Syria that he intended to march on Egypt and bring his rebellious vassal to heel. Saladin, recognizing that armed conflict with Nur al-Din would be catastrophic for Muslim unity and would only benefit the Crusaders, prepared to defend Egypt while simultaneously sending diplomatic messages attempting to repair the relationship. Both sides were maneuvering toward a confrontation that would have split the Muslim world and potentially doomed any hope of reclaiming Jerusalem. And then, on May 15, 1174, Nur al-Din died suddenly in Damascus. He was only 56 years old, struck down by what sources describe as a throat infection or possibly poisoning, though no evidence conclusively proves foul play. His death was a catastrophe for Syrian unity, but an opportunity for Saladin that he recognized immediately. Nur al-Din's heir was his 11-year-old son as-Salih Ismail, a boy utterly incapable of holding together his father's empire. Governors, generals, and princes across Syria began positioning themselves to seize power or carve out independent territories. The carefully constructed authority that Nur al-Din had built over nearly 3 decades disintegrated within weeks. Saladin's decision to march on Damascus was audacious and brilliant. He claimed he was coming to protect young as-Salih from ambitious generals who had used the boy as a puppet. He positioned himself as the defender of Nur al-Din's legacy and the champion of Muslim unity. He promised that he would serve as regent until as-Salih came of age, ensuring stability during a dangerous transition. These were public justifications for what was, in reality, a conquest. Saladin intended to seize control of Syria and add it to his Egyptian power base, creating an empire that could finally challenge the Crusader kingdoms on equal terms. Syria in 1174 was a patchwork of competing interests and broken loyalties. The young boy king as-Salih sat in Aleppo, controlled by a eunuch regent named Gumushtigin, who cared more for power than for the welfare of Islam. Saif ad-Din of Mosul, Nur al-Din's nephew, and a prince with his own ambitions, was busy carving up territories in northern Syria and Mesopotamia, annexing cities that had belonged to Nur al-Din's empire without any concern for the greater threat posed by the Crusader kingdoms. Local governors made deals with Frankish invaders, trading Muslim security for temporary protection against their own Muslim rivals. Raymond III of Tripoli, the most capable Crusader leader, encouraged this division, offering alliances to Muslim princes who feared Saladin more than they feared Christian expansion. The Islamic world that Saladin surveyed was not just divided, it was eating itself alive while foreign armies occupied Jerusalem and held the holy sites of Islam hostage. This was the nightmare that Saladin had sworn to end, and he understood that unity could only come through a combination of overwhelming force, calculated mercy, and the ability to present himself as the champion of a cause greater than personal ambition, the liberation of Jerusalem and the restoration of Muslim dignity. His first targets were the Syrian cities of Homs and Hama. Homs fell on December 9, 1174, though its citadel held out temporarily. The governor had little choice. Saladin's army was battle-hardened from years of Egyptian campaigns, well supplied from Egypt's vast resources, and led by commanders who had proven their skill in sieges and field battles. At Hama, the situation was more complex. The governor, a nobleman loyal to As-Salih in Aleppo, initially agreed to present Saladin's case to the boy king and surrender if Aleppo refused to acknowledge Saladin's authority. It was a reasonable compromise that might have allowed a peaceful resolution. But Gumshtagin, the eunuch regent controlling As-Salih, saw any negotiation with Saladin as treason. He arrested the governor immediately. When news reached Hama, the governor's brother, fearing for his family and recognizing the futility of resistance, surrendered the city to Saladin rather than face Gumshtagin's wrath. By late December 1174, Saladin's small army had reached the gates of Aleppo itself. The city was the key to northern Syria, a wealthy metropolis with formidable walls and a strategic position that controlled trade routes stretching from Anatolia to Mesopotamia. If Saladin could take Aleppo, resistance to his authority would collapse across Syria. He began a siege, surrounding the city and cutting off its supply lines. But the defenders, realizing they could not defeat Saladin through military strength alone, turned to their most terrifying weapon, the assassins. The Order of Assassins, known in Arabic as the Hashishiyin, was a secretive sect of Shia Muslims who had perfected political murder as an instrument of power. Based in the mountain fortresses of Syria and Persia, they were feared throughout the Islamic world for never missing their targets. Kings, generals and princes who defied them lived in constant fear of the knife in the darkness, the poison in the cup, the trusted servant who suddenly became a killer. The assassins operated with religious fanaticism, their killers believing that martyrdom in the act of assassination guaranteed paradise. No bodyguard was trusted absolutely. No security was perfect, because assassins could infiltrate courts and armies by posing as servants, soldiers or scribes for months or even years before striking. In January 1175, assassins infiltrated Saladin's camp outside Aleppo. They posed as soldiers or servants, worked their way close to Saladin's tent, and waited for the moment when the Sultan would be most vulnerable. One night, they entered his tent while he slept. Only by fortune, or divine intervention as many Muslims believed, did Saladin survive. His personal bodyguards, elite Mamluks who had served him since Egypt, were sleeping in shifts near his quarters. They heard movement, rushed into the tent and killed the intruders moments before they could strike. Saladin emerged shaken but alive, and the incident became legendary. Muslims saw it as proof that Allah protected him for some greater purpose. His enemies saw it as a warning that even the assassins could not stop him. Unable to eliminate Saladin through murder, and unable to defeat him in open battle, Aleppo's defenders sought an alliance with the very enemy that all Muslims should have been fighting together, the Crusaders. Raymond III of Tripoli, serving as regent of the Kingdom of Jerusalem during King Baldwin III's illness, led a Frankish army to Homs in early 1175. The message was clear. If Saladin persisted in attacking Muslim territories, the Crusaders would intervene on the side of his enemies. This was the bitter reality that fueled Saladin's determination. Muslim leaders would rather ally with Christian invaders than submit to a leader who wanted to unite them against those same invaders. The irony was crushing. The very people who claimed to defend Islam were using Christian armies to preserve their own power. The Franks withdrew when Saladin approached with his army, recognizing they were being used as pawns in a Muslim civil war they did not fully understand and did not want to escalate into full-scale conflict. Their intervention had achieved its goal of forcing Saladin to abandon the siege of Aleppo, at least temporarily. Saladin captured the citadel of Homs, which had been holding out since December, and then took Baalbek, the very city where his father had once served as governor decades earlier. The capture of Baalbek was emotionally significant for Saladin. He was reclaiming his family's heritage while simultaneously building an empire. He now controlled all of Syria south of Hama. But his successes had awakened a far more dangerous enemy, Saif ad-Din of Mosul, who had been busy conquering northern territories for himself and expanding his own power base in Mesopotamia, finally understood that Saladin represented a threat to his own ambitions. If Saladin unified all of Syria and Egypt, the balance of power in the Muslim world would shift dramatically, and Mosul would become a secondary player rather than a great power. In summer 1175, Saif ad-Din assembled a massive army, reportedly 20,000 strong, and formed an alliance with Gumushtigin in Aleppo. Their combined forces marched towards Saladin, who waited at Hama with an army that was outnumbered and still waiting for reinforcements from Egypt. The situation was desperate. If Saladin lost this battle, his entire Syrian campaign would collapse. His enemies would divide his territories among themselves. Egypt might even be invaded. Everything he had built over 6 years hung in the balance. Negotiations began, as was customary before major battles in medieval warfare. Emissaries rode between the camps carrying proposals and counter-proposals. Saladin, understanding his weak position militarily, agreed to terms that seemed like surrender. He would recognize Salih as king, acknowledge Aleppo's supremacy over Syria, and return Homs, Hama, and Baalbek to their previous allegiances. These were crushing concessions that would reduce him from master of Syria to merely governor of Damascus, dependent on Aleppo's goodwill. His emirs were stunned. Many believed he was showing weakness and urged him to fight rather than accept such humiliating terms. But then Saif ad-Din and Gumushtigin overplayed their hand. They demanded that Saladin also return Rappa, a town on the upper Euphrates that had belonged to his uncle Shirkuh. After Shirkuh's death, Saladin had restored Rappa to Shirkuh's son, his cousin, as an inheritance rightfully owed to family. To surrender Rappa would be to betray family loyalty, one of the most sacred obligations in Kurdish culture. It would make Saladin look weak in front of his own officers, many of whom were kinsmen who served him precisely because he honoured family bonds. It would cost him prestige among his Kurdish tribal supporters, without whom his army would disintegrate. The demand was a test to see if Saladin could be bullied into total submission. Saladin refused. He sent back a message saying that Rabba belonged to his family by right and would not be surrendered. If Saif ad-Din wanted it, he would have to take it by force. The negotiations collapsed immediately and battle became inevitable. Both armies began moving toward each other, and on April 13, 1175, they clashed at a location that would become known in history as the Horns of Hammer, named for two prominent hills that dominated the battlefield. Before we witness the greatest battle of the Crusades era, if you're loving this deep dive into the brutal truth of medieval warfare, head over to our merch store, Rep Your. Favourite historical battles with Wars in History gear that shows you know real history. Link in the description. Now, let's talk about Hattin. Reynald of Châtillon was not a man who understood restraint. A French adventurer who had carved out power in the Kingdom of Jerusalem through marriage and violence, he ruled the fortress of Kerak from his impregnable stronghold, overlooking the trade routes between Egypt and Syria. He had spent years raiding Muslim caravans, plundering their wealth, and torturing their merchants with a cruelty that shocked even his fellow Crusaders. In 1182, he had launched an audacious naval raid into the Red Sea itself, attacking Muslim pilgrimage ships and threatening the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Saladin had sworn a personal oath that Reynald would die by his hand for that sacrilege, but the 4-year truce signed in 1185 had temporarily protected the Crusader lord from retribution. King Guy's political weakness was rooted in how he had gained the throne in the first place. When Baldwin IV, the leper king, died in 1185, the crown passed to his nephew Baldwin V, a sickly child who died within a year. The succession crisis that followed tore the kingdom apart. Guy de Lusignan had married Sibylla, Baldwin IV's sister, giving him a claim to the throne. But Raymond III of Tripoli, the most experienced military commander and politician in the kingdom, had been regent and believed he deserved to rule. The High Court of Jerusalem was split between Guy's faction and Raymond's faction, with bitter personal animosities fueling the political divide. Raymond had actually made a separate peace treaty with Saladin during the succession crisis, allowing Muslim forces to pass through his territory of Galilee without resistance. This pragmatic but controversial move earned him accusations of being a traitor or Muslim sympathizer from his enemies. When Sibylla was crowned queen and immediately crowned Guy as king in a rushed ceremony that bypassed normal procedures, Raymond withdrew to Tiberias in fury and briefly considered open rebellion. The kingdom was on the verge of civil war even as Saladin's power grew across the border. Reynald of Châtillon understood this political weakness and exploited it ruthlessly. His fortress of Kerak was practically independent, positioned on the vital trade routes between Egypt and Syria. Every caravan that passed through paid tribute to Reynald or faced attack. He had grown enormously wealthy from this highway robbery, and he used that wealth to maintain a private army loyal only to him. When the truce was signed in 1185, Reynald saw it as a temporary inconvenience rather than a binding obligation. In his view, he was at permanent war with Islam, and no treaty could change that fundamental reality. In late 1186 or early 1187, a massive caravan made its way from Cairo toward Damascus, laden with trade goods and travelling under the protection of the truce. The caravan carried civilians, merchants, and possibly Saladin's own sister, according to some accounts, though this detail remains disputed by historians. What is certain is that the caravan was enormous, hundreds of camels laden with trade goods worth a fortune, travelling with merchants, their families, guards, and servants. When Reynald's forces swept down from Kerak, they captured everything. The prisoners were thrown into Kerak's dungeons, one of the most notorious prisons in the Crusader States. Reynald had a reputation for torturing captives, throwing them from Kerak's walls into the ravine below, or simply leaving them to die of thirst in the blazing summer sun. When word reached Jerusalem, King Guy de Lusignan was horrified. He summoned Reynold to the royal court and ordered him to release the prisoners and return the plunder immediately. The truce was the only thing preventing Saladin's vastly superior forces from invading the kingdom, and Guy understood that Reynold's actions could trigger catastrophic war. But Reynold stood before the king and the assembled nobles and simply refused. He declared that the truce did not apply to him personally, that his territory was sovereign, and that no king could command him to show mercy to infidels. It was an act of stunning defiance that revealed how hollow Guy's authority really was. If the king could not enforce a truce that he himself had signed, if a vassal could openly defy royal commands without consequence, then the kingdom of Jerusalem was not really a kingdom at all, but a collection of feudal lords held together by nothing more than fear of external enemies. Guy was too weak politically to force Reynold's compliance. He had only gained his throne through marriage to Sibylla, and his authority was challenged by powerful nobles who despised him as an incompetent outsider. Raymond III of Tripoli, the most experienced military commander in the kingdom and former regent, barely concealed his contempt for Guy's leadership. Guy's inability to punish Reynold or force compliance destroyed any possibility of maintaining peace. When news of the caravan attack reached Saladin, his response was immediate and uncompromising. But it was not driven solely by religious fury or outrage at broken treaties. It was strategic calculation combined with genuine grievance. The Muslim world had watched Saladin unite territories, defeat rival Muslim rulers, and position himself as the champion of jihad. But he had then signed a 4-year truce with the Crusaders instead of immediately attacking Jerusalem. Some of his own emirs questioned whether Saladin truly intended to liberate the Holy City, or whether he was content to rule his empire and avoid the risks of war with the Franks. Reynold's caravan attack gave Saladin the perfect justification to break the truce without appearing to violate his own word. The Franks had broken the peace first through Reynold's actions and Guy's failure to punish him. Now, Saladin could present himself as the wronged party, the leader forced to take up arms because his enemies had betrayed their oaths. He sent messengers to Guy demanding justice, compensation, and the immediate release of the prisoners. Guy could not deliver. Saladin then sent word throughout his empire. The jihad was beginning. The truce was void. Every Muslim ruler who had sworn allegiance to him was obligated to send troops. In the spring of 1187, armies began converging from Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and beyond. The greatest Muslim military force assembled since the First Crusade gathered under Saladin's banner. Chroniclers estimated his army at between 20,000 and 30,000 men, including elite Mamluk cavalry trained in Egyptian barracks, Turkish horse archers whose families had been raiding and fighting for generations, Syrian infantry hardened by years of border warfare, Egyptian regiments, Kurdish tribal warriors loyal to Saladin's family, and contingents from every corner of his empire. This was not a raiding force. This was an army of conquest. Saladin's planning for the 1187 campaign revealed the meticulous attention to detail that separated him from ordinary commanders. He spent months assembling not just troops, but the logistical support necessary to sustain a major offensive. Medieval armies did not carry weeks of supplies with them. They relied on foraging, local purchases, and supply trains that followed behind the combat troops. Saladin organized camel caravans carrying grain, dried meat, water in massive leather bags, tens of thousands of arrows, spare weapons, horseshoes for the cavalry mounts, medical supplies, siege equipment, and everything else an army of this size would need to operate deep in enemy territory for months. He also engaged in psychological warfare before the campaign began. Muslim forces conducted raids across the Kingdom of Jerusalem's borders throughout the spring of 1187, burning villages, capturing isolated fortresses, and spreading terror among the Christian population. The goal was not territorial conquest, but to create an atmosphere of crisis that would pressure Guy into making mistakes. Saladin understood that Guy was politically weak and militarily inexperienced. By threatening multiple locations simultaneously, Saladin could force Guy into impossible choices: defend everywhere and be strong nowhere, or concentrate forces and leave other areas vulnerable. Saladin's strategy was methodical and brilliant. In late June 1187, he led his massive army across the Jordan River and established his main camp at Kafr Sabt, just south of the Sea of Galilee. The position was perfect, close enough to threaten multiple Crusader cities, with access to water for his troops and horses, and positioned to intercept any Crusader army that tried to march east. He sent his son Al-Afdal with a large detachment to raid the countryside around Acre, drawing attention and spreading panic among the civilian population. Smoke from burning villages could be seen for miles, and refugees fled westward carrying tales of Muslim invasion. Then, on July 2nd, 1187, Saladin personally led the bulk of his army to attack Tiberias, a fortified city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. The decision to attack Tiberias was the culmination of months of strategic planning. Tiberias was not the most valuable city in the kingdom, nor was it the most heavily fortified, but it was perfect for Saladin's purposes. It belonged to Raymond III of Tripoli, Guy's political rival, and the kingdom's most capable military mind. Raymond's wife Eschiva was inside with a small garrison. If Raymond did nothing while his own city burned and his wife faced capture, he would be humiliated as a man who abandoned his family. His political enemies would destroy him. But if the Crusaders marched to relieve Tiberias, they would have to cross 15 miles of barren, waterless terrain in the height of summer, while being constantly harassed by Saladin's mobile cavalry. Either way, Saladin won. The Crusader leadership gathered at Sepphoris, a well-watered camp about 16 miles west of Tiberias, to decide their response. Guy assembled every available fighting man in the kingdom. The army that gathered represented the total military strength of the Crusader States, approximately sustained 200 heavily armoured knights, the core striking force who had trained for war since childhood, about 1,000 light cavalry, including Turcopoles, local Christian cavalry trained to fight in the Eastern style, and between 10,000 and 15,000 infantry, a mix of professional crossbowmen, spearmen trained in defending against cavalry charges, and feudal levies, farmers and townsmen called up for military service. This was the largest Christian army ever assembled in the history of the Crusader kingdoms. To raise it, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had stripped every castle of its garrison, abandoned the defence of every city, emptied the royal treasury to hire mercenaries, and even melted down church treasures to pay for equipment. If this army was destroyed, the kingdom would fall. The Council of War on the night of July Asr descended into vicious argument that revealed all the political fractures tearing the kingdom apart. Raymond III, whose wife was besieged in Tiberias and whose city was burning, stunned everyone by arguing passionately against marching to her relief. He understood Saladin's trap perfectly. The route to Tiberias crossed arid hills with no reliable water sources except for a few springs that Saladin's forces could easily seize or poison. The distance was only 16 miles, but in full armour under the July sun, carrying weapons and shields, it would take 8 to 10 hours of marching. Saladin's army would harass them constantly with arrows from horse archers who could shoot and retreat faster than armoured knights could pursue. They would never be allowed to rest, never be allowed to drink, never be allowed to maintain. Formation without constant attacks designed to exhaust and demoralize them. Raymond argued they should remain at Sepphoris, where water was plentiful, the defensive position was strong, and they could force Saladin to come to them. Let Saladin besiege Tiberias. The city's citadel was strong and could hold for weeks, possibly months. Eshiva and the garrison had supplies and could endure. Eventually Saladin would have to either attack the Crusader army in its fortified camp, which would be suicidal against prepared defences, or withdraw when his own supplies ran out and his emirs grew tired of fruitless campaigning. Raymond was willing to sacrifice his own city, risk his wife's life, and endure personal humiliation to preserve the kingdom's army. It was the advice of a man who understood medieval warfare, who had fought Saladin for years, and who recognized that patience and defensive strategy were the only ways the outnumbered Crusaders could survive. Gerard de Riedefort, the Grand, master of the Knights Templar, argued for immediate attack with a fury that bordered on hysteria. He despised Raymond as a coward and possibly a traitor. Just months earlier, Raymond had allowed a Muslim detachment to pass through his territory as part of a separate peace agreement, and that detachment had massacred a Templar force. Gerard had never forgiven him. Now Gerard accused Raymond of deliberately advocating strategy that would benefit Saladin, of being more concerned with avoiding battle than with defending Christianity, of hiding behind the walls of Sepphoris while a Christian city burned and a noblewoman faced capture or death. The Templars and Hospitallers, the military orders that formed the professional corps of the Crusader army, demanded action. These were warrior monks who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicating their entire lives to fighting for the cross. They had built and garrisoned the greatest fortresses in the kingdom, trained constantly for war, and developed a reputation for never retreating even when facing certain death. Their pride, their identity, and their entire existence was built around the idea that Christians should attack rather than cower. The thought of remaining at Sepphoris while Saladin ravaged Christian lands was intolerable to their warrior ethos. Raynald of Châtillon, whose actions had triggered the entire crisis, joined Gerard in pushing for an aggressive response. The younger, more hot-blooded nobles could not stomach the idea of hiding at Sepphoris while a Christian city burned and a noblewoman faced capture. The political pressure on Guy was enormous. He was already seen as weak, as a king who owed his throne to his wife rather than his own abilities. If he refused to fight now, if he let Raymond's city fall without even attempting relief, his enemies would use this to destroy him politically. He would be remembered as the coward king who hid behind walls while Saladin conquered the kingdom, piece by piece. Guy, lacking the strength of character to impose his will and make the hard decision that military necessity demanded, initially sided with Raymond. The council broke up with the decision made. They would remain at Sepphoris and let Saladin exhaust himself besieging Tiberias. The nobles dispersed to their tents, the soldiers settled in for the night, and the camp gradually quieted as men tried to sleep despite the summer heat, and the knowledge that Tiberias was burning 16 miles to the east. But that night Gerard de Riedefort gained private access to the king's tent. What he said in that midnight conversation is not recorded by any chronicler, but its effects shattered Guy's resolve and doomed the kingdom. Gerard accused the king of cowardice. He reminded Guy that his throne was contested, his authority questioned by powerful nobles who believed he had no business being king. He pointed out that Raymond was Guy's enemy, that Raymond had wanted the throne for himself, that Raymond's advice to avoid battle might be deliberate sabotage designed to make Guy look weak. He painted a picture of what would happen if Guy stayed at Sepphoris. Raymond would eventually negotiate his wife's release through his personal connections with Saladin, making himself look like the hero while Guy appeared useless. The nobility would rally around Raymond, demanding a new king who would actually fight. Guy would be deposed within months, possibly imprisoned or exiled, remembered forever as the coward who let the kingdom fall without striking a single blow. Gerard's argument struck at Guy's deepest insecurities, his fear of being seen as weak, his terror of losing the throne he had fought so hard to gain, his desperate need to prove himself to nobles who openly mocked him. The weak king, alone in his tent in the middle of the night, listening to a man who spoke with absolute certainty and appealed to his pride rather than his reason, crumbled completely. Guy made the decision that would destroy everything. At dawn on July 30, 1187, trumpets sounded throughout the Crusader camp at Sepphoris. Guy summoned his commanders and announced the army would march to Tiberias immediately. Raymond was reportedly devastated, understanding that the kingdom had just been doomed by one man's political cowardice and insecurity. He knew what was coming. He had fought Saladin for years, understood the Sultan's tactical brilliance, and recognized the trap that had been laid. But orders were orders. Raymond was a vassal sworn to obey his king, and Guy had made his decision. There was nothing left but to march toward disaster and hope for a miracle. At sunrise on that fatal Friday morning, the Crusader army abandoned the springs of Sepphoris and began marching east toward Tiberias. They moved in their traditional formation that had been developed over decades of warfare in the east, infantry surrounding the cavalry, marching in tight columns designed to protect against harassment. The heavily armoured knights rode in the centre, their mail armour glinting in the rising sun, their surcoats displaying the heraldic symbols of noble families, their horses already beginning to feel the heat. The infantry formed a protective screen around them, shields raised, weapons ready. Every man carried what water he could, leather bags, wooden canteens, whatever containers they possessed, but there were no supply trains, no reserves. They expected to reach the springs at Turan by evening, refill their water supplies, and then continue to Tiberias the following day. The moment the Crusader column left Sepphoris, Saladin's scouts reported the movement. The Sultan, watching from his command position near Tiberias, could barely believe his fortune. They had taken the bait completely. Every calculation he had made, every prediction about how Guy's political weakness and inexperience would lead him to make catastrophic decisions, was proving correct. Saladin immediately ordered his army to abandon the siege of Tiberias. The city no longer mattered, and deploy to intercept the Crusaders. His strategy was simple and devastating. Never allow them to reach water, harass them constantly, exhaust them, demoralize them, and when they finally collapsed, destroy them completely. By mid-morning on July 3rd, Muslim cavalry appeared on the flanks and rear of the Crusader column. They did not charge directly into contact but maintained a distance of about 100 yards, just outside the effective range of Crusader crossbows, but close enough for their own composite bows to be devastatingly effective. The horse archers operated with the efficiency of men who had trained for this their entire lives. Turkish and Mamluk cavalry were taught to ride from the age of 4 or 5, to shoot arrows from horseback before they were 10 years old, to fight as units coordinated by flags and drum signals. Each mounted archer carried multiple quivers with dozens of arrows slung across his back and saddle. With thousands of archers operating in coordinated waves, the volume of arrow fire was overwhelming. The tactic was called the Parthian shot, in reference to ancient Persian cavalry, though by the 12th century it had been perfected by Turkish horse archers across Central Asia and the Middle East. Groups of cavalry would gallop toward the Crusader column at an angle, loose arrows in rapid volleys, and then wheel away before the heavily armoured Crusaders could respond. As one group retreated to rearm and rest their horses, another group would attack from a different direction. The pattern repeated endlessly, creating a continuous storm of arrows that fell on the Christian army from dawn until dusk. The Crusader infantry bore the worst of it. Marching in heavy quilted padding under mail armour or leather jerkins, carrying large shields to protect themselves from the arrow storm, they suffered agonizing casualties from the very first hours. Medieval arrows could not always penetrate good armour, but they found the gaps: faces, necks, legs, feet, hands gripping weapons. Even when arrows did not penetrate, the impact was bruising and exhausting. A man struck by a dozen arrows that did not break his armour still felt 12 hammer blows that left him battered and struggling. Men fell constantly, struck down by arrows that found fatal targets, or simply by exhaustion and heat stroke in the brutal July sun. The knights wanted desperately to charge and break the Muslim cavalry, to use their superior armour and close combat training to smash the enemy. But that was exactly what Saladin wanted them to do. Several times during the morning, groups of Crusader knights broke formation and charged at the Muslim horse archers. Each time, the lightly armoured Muslim cavalry simply scattered and rode away, their faster horses easily outpacing the heavily burdened Crusader war horses. The Christians would pursue for a few hundred yards, accomplish nothing, and then return to the column having exhausted their horses and achieved zero tactical gain. The Muslim archers would reform and resume shooting as if nothing had happened. Guy kept the army together through sheer will, maintaining the formation and pushing east toward Turan and its precious water sources. But the miles crawled by with agonizing slowness. The standard Crusader marching formation placed infantry on the outside for protection, but infantry carrying shields, weapons, and armour could only march at about 2 miles per hour even in good conditions. In the July heat, under constant attack, on rocky terrain that seemed designed to twist ankles and exhaust men, their pace slowed even further. What should have been an 8-hour march became a nightmare trek where every mile took an hour or more. By midday, when the sun reached its brutal zenith and the heat became unbearable, the water each man carried was gone. Leather water bags that had seemed full at dawn were drained to the last drop. Soldiers who had rationed carefully still found themselves with dry canteens and throats that felt like they were full of sand. Thirst in armoured men marching under the blazing summer sun is not the mild discomfort of missing a meal. It is physical agony. Lips crack and bleed. Tongues swell until speech becomes difficult. The body's temperature regulation fails, leading to dizziness, confusion, and hallucinations. Men began seeing water where there was none, believing they had reached springs that did not exist. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical casualties. Imagine marching for hours under that merciless sun, weighed down by 30 to 50 pounds of armour and weapons, watching comrades fall with arrows in their backs or collapse from heat exhaustion, knowing that at any moment you might be next, and being completely unable to strike back because the enemy stayed just out of reach. The constant arrow fire meant you could never relax, never lower your shield, never stop scanning the horizon for the next attack. The casualties mounted not in dramatic charges or heroic last stands, but in a slow, grinding attrition that destroyed morale as effectively as it killed soldiers. By mid-afternoon, scouts brought Guy the news that shattered any remaining hope. Saladin's forces had seized the springs at Turan ahead of them. The water they desperately needed, the goal that had kept men marching despite exhaustion and arrows, was now in enemy hands. Guy faced an impossible situation. Turan was still miles ahead and now occupied by enemy forces. The Sea of Galilee and the safety of Tiberias was nearly 10 miles away, too far to reach before nightfall given their exhausted condition. Behind them, Sepphoris and its water was equally unreachable, and retreating would mean abandoning any pretense of relieving Tiberias and admitting complete defeat. Raymond reportedly begged Guy to push forward through the night, toward the lake. It was a desperate gamble, forcing exhausted men to march through darkness, risking the army breaking apart in the confusion, potentially walking into ambushes, but it was the only chance. If they could reach the Sea of Galilee by dawn, they could water the troops, regroup, and at least have a fighting chance. But the infantry were literally collapsing. Men fell to the ground and could not be made to rise. Horses were dying, simply stopping in their tracks as their hearts gave out from heat and exhaustion. The wounded from the day's arrow fire numbered in the hundreds, maybe thousands. The army was disintegrating before Guy's eyes. By late afternoon on July 3rd, 1187, standing on a waterless plateau with his army collapsing around him and Muslim cavalry surrounding them on all sides, King Guy de Lusignan made the decision that would destroy his kingdom. He ordered the army to halt and make camp. They would rest for the night and resume the march at dawn. It was the decision of a man who could not accept that there were no good options, who hoped that somehow things would improve, who could not face the reality that his army was trapped and doomed. The location where they stopped was called the Horns of Hattin, named for two volcanic peaks that rose above the plateau like demonic horns. There was no water anywhere nearby. There was no defensible position. There were no walls, no fortifications, no natural obstacles. It was simply the place where the Crusader army could go no further, the spot where exhaustion and thirst and defeat finally stopped their forward motion. As the sun set on July 3rd, painting the sky blood red, the Muslims surrounded the Crusader camp completely. Saladin ordered his men to bring up the supply trains, camels loaded with water in massive leather bags, food, fresh arrows by the tens of thousands, and everything his troops needed. His soldiers rested, drank deeply from water that seemed impossibly precious to them, watching Christians, ate hot meals, and prepared for the slaughter that would come with dawn. Musicians played in the Muslim camp. Prayers were said. The mood was celebratory because every man in Saladin's army understood they had already won. In the Crusader camp, men experienced hell on earth. Some tried to lick dew from rocks, finding perhaps a few drops of moisture that did nothing to slake their thirst. Others attempted to drink their own urine, a desperate act that only made dehydration worse. Some men wept openly, others prayed, begging God for deliverance that would not come. Many simply lay down and waited for death, too exhausted even to care anymore. The knights knew what morning would bring. They had seen enough warfare to understand that an army without water, surrounded by enemies, had no chance of survival. Some wrote final messages for loved ones, messages that would never be delivered. Others checked their weapons one last time, determined to die fighting rather than surrender. Saladin did not rest. He was not a commander who delegated everything and relaxed while subordinates handled details. Throughout the night he rode through his camp, checking on different units, refining his battle plan, positioning his forces for the dawn attack. He placed his heavy cavalry, the Mamluk lancers in their armour, where they could charge if the Crusaders tried to break out. He positioned his horse archers to surround the Christians completely, ensuring no escape was possible. He brought the siege equipment forward, not catapults for walls but incendiary materials for a tactic that would prove devastatingly effective. At dawn on July 4th, 1187, Saladin ordered his men to set fire to the dry grass and scrub brush surrounding the Crusader position. The summer heat had turned the vegetation to tinder, and flames spread rapidly. The wind, as if God himself favoured the Muslim cause, carried smoke and heat directly toward the Christian army, already suffering unbearable thirst. The Crusaders now found themselves choking on smoke, their eyes streaming with tears, the air itself becoming an enemy. The psychological impact was immense. It felt like fighting in hell itself, surrounded by fire and enemies and certain death. Then the arrow storm began again, even heavier than the previous day. Saladin had fresh troops, rested horses and full quivers. He rotated his archer units so that some groups were always shooting while others rested. The volume of fire was so intense that the sky seemed to darken with arrows. Chronicles from both sides describe arrows falling like rain, the air full of their whistling flight, the ground carpeted with shafts. The Crusader infantry, who had spent the night without water after marching all the previous day under the sun, began to break almost immediately. This was not cowardice. These men had endured hours of nightmare already. It was the simple reality that human bodies have limits. Without water, after extreme exertion, subjected to heat and smoke and constant attack, men's minds and bodies simply stop functioning. Groups of foot soldiers tried to flee toward the lake visible in the distance, thinking they could escape and reach water. They were cut down by Muslim cavalry, slaughtered by the hundreds as they ran. Others refused to move at all, sitting down on the ground with their shields over their heads, waiting passively for death because fighting seemed pointless. The cohesion that had barely held the army together during the previous day's march shattered completely. Infantry units abandoned their positions, leaving gaps in the defensive formation. Knights who had relied on infantry protection found themselves exposed to direct cavalry charges. The carefully organised army that had left Sepphoris 30 hours earlier disintegrated into scattered groups fighting for survival without coordination or strategy. Raymond III, commanding the vanguard with his knights, made a desperate decision. He gathered his cavalry, several hundred armoured knights, the best trained warriors in the Christian army, and led a charge directly at the Muslim lines. His intent was either to break through and perhaps reach water at the lake, or to die fighting rather than be captured. It was the decision of a man who understood the battle was lost and chose to go out on his own terms. Saladin, watching from his command position and recognizing Raymond's intent, made a decision that revealed his tactical brilliance. Instead of meeting the charge head-on, which would have resulted in brutal close combat fighting, he ordered his men to open ranks and let Raymond's charge pass through. The Muslim lines simply parted, and Raymond and his knights galloped through the gap, thundering down toward the lake and freedom. Once Raymond's force was through and separated from the main Crusader army, Saladin's troops closed ranks again, trapping the remainder. Whether Raymond's escape was cowardice, pragmatism, or a final act of defiance against the king who had ignored his counsel remains debated by historians. Medieval chroniclers on the Christian side called him a traitor who abandoned his comrades. Muslim sources praised Saladin's cleverness in letting him go rather than wasting troops fighting him. What is certain is that Raymond's departure removed the kingdom's most capable military commander from the battlefield and further demoralized those who remained, who now believed their own leaders were fleeing. Guy and the main body of the Crusader army, perhaps 700, 800 knights still mounted, and whatever infantry remained combat effective, retreated to the horns themselves, the two volcanic hills that offered at least some elevated ground. The knights, still in their armour despite the hellish heat because removing it would leave them vulnerable, formed a defensive perimeter around the true cross, the relic brought from Jerusalem that represented the spiritual heart of the Crusader cause. This piece of wood, believed to be from the actual cross on which Christ was crucified, was the most sacred object in the kingdom. Its presence on the battlefield was meant to inspire the troops and invoke God's protection. Saladin's forces pressed the attack from all sides, surrounding the hills completely. The arrow fire continued without pause. Muslim heavy cavalry, the elite Mamluks in their armour riding powerful war horses, charged up the slopes. Saladin coordinated the assault personally, directing units to weak points, rotating fresh troops to replace exhausted ones, maintaining relentless pressure. The Crusader knights fought with desperate courage, knowing they faced death or captivity but refusing to surrender. The battle on the hills was brutal hand-to-hand combat, swords, maces, axes, and lances in a chaotic melee where training and armour meant less than sheer numbers. At midday, when the heat reached its maximum intensity and some of the Christian knights were literally collapsing from heatstroke inside their armour, Saladin ordered a general assault from all directions simultaneously. His heavy cavalry charged up the hills while archers maintained their devastating barrage and infantry rushed forward to engage any defenders who had lost their mounts. The Crusader defence, weakened by 2 days of nightmare, finally broke. King Guy's tent was overrun. The red banner of the kingdom fell. Guy himself was captured alive, dragged from his horse and held by Saladin's guards. Raynal of Châtillon was captured moments later. Gérard de Riedefort, the Templar Grand Master who had convinced Guy to march to this disaster, was taken prisoner. Most of the surviving nobility, barons, counts, knights of noble blood, were captured. The true cross, defended to the last by knights who died holding it, fell into Muslim hands when its defenders were finally overwhelmed. The Templar and Hospitaller knights, who had sworn vows to never retreat and never surrender, fought literally to the last man, or until they were physically overwhelmed and captured. These warrior monks had no families to ransom them, no political value beyond their military skill, and they knew their fate if captured. Many died on those hills, surrounded by enemies, fighting until they could no longer lift their weapons. Those captured alive numbered approximately 230 Templars and Hospitallers. By mid-afternoon, the Battle of Hattin was over. The Kingdom of Jerusalem's army, the largest force the Crusader States had ever assembled, had been completely annihilated. Approximately 1,000 knights had been killed or captured. Nearly all of the infantry, perhaps 10,000, 15,000 men, had been slaughtered, captured, or had died from thirst in desperate attempts to reach the lake. It was the most complete military disaster in Crusader history, worse than any previous defeat because it destroyed not just an army but the entire military capacity of the kingdom. The prisoners were brought to Saladin's tent, which had been erected on the battlefield in a position where the Sultan could watch the final stages of the battle. The heat was still overwhelming even in late afternoon, and the captives were barely conscious from thirst. Many had not drunk water in over 30 hours while wearing armour and fighting. Some were delirious, hallucinating, unable to stand without support. Saladin, in a gesture that contemporary chroniclers from both sides praised as chivalrous, offered a cup of cool water, brought from his supplies and cooled in the traditional method of wrapping water containers in wet cloth, to King Guy. Guy drank desperately, the water probably seeming like the most precious thing he had ever tasted. Then, following the customs of medieval hospitality, he passed the cup to Raynald of Châtillon standing beside him. This seemingly innocent act triggered one of the most famous confrontations of the Crusades. Saladin immediately grew angry and spoke harshly. In the customs of the time, offering water or food to a prisoner signalled mercy and protection. It created a bond of hospitality that honour demanded be respected. Guy, probably not even thinking clearly after the trauma of battle and dehydration, had inadvertently extended that protection to Raynald. But Saladin had made an oath years earlier, after Raynald's Red Sea raids threatened the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, that Raynald would die by his own hand. The Sultan's honour demanded he keep that oath. Through an interpreter, Saladin spoke Arabic and Kurdish while Raynald spoke French. The Sultan reminded the Crusader lord of his crimes, the broken truces, going back years before the current crisis. The attacks on pilgrimage caravans that violated the fundamental customs of warfare. The Red Sea raids that had threatened Islam's holiest sites. The torture of Muslim prisoners that Raynald had indulged in with enthusiasm, the latest caravan attack that had violated the 4-year truce and triggered this entire war. Saladin offered Raynald a final chance, a choice that Islamic law required be offered to captives, convert to Islam and be spared. It was not a serious offer. Everyone in the tent knew Raynald would never accept, but the ritual had to be observed. Raynald, arrogant and defiant to the last, refused with contempt. Some sources say he spat at Saladin or made insulting remarks about Muhammad. Others say he simply refused silently. What happened next became legendary. Saladin stood, drew his sword, and struck Raynald across the shoulder and arm, inflicting a deep wound but not killing him instantly. The Sultan was not a professional executioner, and his blow, while powerful, did not completely sever the limbs or decapitate as a trained executioner might have. Saladin's bodyguards immediately stepped forward and finished the execution, striking Raynald multiple times until he was dead. His body was dragged from the tent and, decapitated, his head displayed before the assembled prisoners as a warning and a symbol of justice done. King Guy, watching in horror just feet away, reportedly feared he would be next. He had seen Saladin kill a prisoner with his own hands moments earlier. He was the king of the enemy kingdom, responsible for the war. Why would he be spared? Saladin, seeing Guy's terror, spoke to reassure him through interpreters. Kings do not kill kings. It was a statement of the chivalric code that governed medieval warfare among the nobility. Guy's life was spared not from mercy, but from the customs that required rulers to treat captured enemy rulers with respect. Guy would remain a prisoner, eventually to be ransomed or exchanged, but he would not be executed. The fate of the other captured knights was determined by military necessity and religious fervour. The secular knights and nobles, approximately 200 men of noble blood, were held for ransom as was customary in medieval warfare. These prisoners had families who would pay enormous sums for their release. They had political value as hostages. Some would be freed within months, others would remain captive for years, but they would live. The Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller faced a very different fate. These military orders had sworn lifelong vows to fight Islam. They owned no property, had no families to ransom them, and would return to warfare the moment they were released. They represented the most dangerous core of Crusader military power. Professional soldiers who trained constantly, never surrendered, and formed the backbone of every Crusader army. From Saladin's perspective, releasing them made no strategic sense. But the decision to execute them was also driven by religious fervour. Saladin had positioned himself as the champion of jihad, the liberator of Muslim lands, the defender of Islam against foreign invasion. Among his army were religious scholars, Sufi mystics, and holy men who had joined the campaign specifically to participate in holy war. A group of these Sufi mystics and scholars, men who had never wielded a sword in anger, requested the honour of executing the captured military knights themselves. Saladin agreed. One by one, approximately 230 Templars and Hospitallers were brought forward. Each was offered the choice: convert to Islam or die. These were men who had sworn vows to fight for Christianity until death. Not one accepted conversion. The executions took hours, carried out by religious scholars who had no training in killing. The contemporary historian Imad al-Din al-Isfahani, who witnessed the scene, wrote with approval that Saladin watched calmly, occasionally smiling when an execution was done well, pleased to see the kingdom's most fanatical warriors eliminated. Some of the executions were quick and clean, many were butchered badly, the amateur executioners requiring multiple strokes to sever heads or kill the prisoners. The common infantry who survived, the battle, numbered in the thousands, faced a different horror. They were considered spoils of war, property to be divided among the victorious soldiers. Thousands were sold into slavery. The slave markets of Damascus and Cairo were flooded with Christian captives over the following weeks. Supply exceeded demand so dramatically that prices collapsed to almost nothing. Contemporary sources report that a single healthy male prisoner could be traded for a pair of sandals. Many prisoners died during the forced marches to the slave markets, their bodies left to rot along the roads. Those who survived faced lives of slavery in mines, galleys, construction projects, or domestic service. The True Cross was sent to Damascus as a trophy, the ultimate symbol of Christian defeat. It was tied upside down to a lance, a deliberate insult, and dragged through the streets while crowds jeered and spat upon it. For Christians throughout Europe, when news of this desecration reached them months later, the loss of the True Cross was almost as devastating as the military defeat itself. This relic had been in Jerusalem since the time of Constantine, nearly 900 years. Its loss seemed to signify that God himself had abandoned the Crusader cause. Saladin had achieved what no Muslim commander had accomplished since the First Crusade traumatized the Islamic world 88 years earlier. In a single day, fighting a battle that lasted perhaps 5 hours of actual combat after 2 days of maneuvering, he had destroyed the military power of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Every castle, every city, every fortress in the Crusader States was now stripped of defenders. The nobility who governed those territories were dead or captive. The soldiers who garrisoned the fortresses had died at Hattin. The road to Jerusalem lay open, defended by nothing more than old men, women, and whoever could be scraped together from the civilian population. He had not just won a battle, he had orchestrated a masterpiece of strategy that combined psychological manipulation, tactical brilliance, and ruthless execution. He had used his understanding of the Crusaders' political divisions to pressure them into abandoning a strong defensive position. He had used Guy's personal weakness and insecurity to manipulate the king into making catastrophic decisions. He had used terrain, climate, and logistics as weapons as deadly as any sword or arrow. He had demonstrated mercy to those he respected, secular knights who would be ransomed, and ruthless efficiency against those he deemed too dangerous to spare, the military orders. As the sun set on July 4th, 1187, over the corpse-strewn hills of Hattin, Saladin stood at the pinnacle of his military career. The Crusader kingdoms that had seemed invincible for nearly a century were now defenceless. The question was not whether they would fall, but how quickly. And at the centre of everything, gleaming in the distance like a jewel waiting to be claimed, stood Jerusalem, the holy city, the prize that every Muslim had dreamed of reclaiming since the massacres of 1099, the city whose liberation would forever cement Saladin's place in history as the champion of Islam and the destroyer of the Crusader dream. The march to Jerusalem would begin immediately. The cities fell like dominoes. Within days of Hattin, Saladin's forces swept across the kingdom of Jerusalem, capturing fortress after fortress, city after city, almost without resistance. The news of the catastrophic defeat spread faster than Saladin's armies could march. Refugees fleeing from the battlefield carried tales of complete annihilation, of the king captured, of the true cross lost, of entire armies slaughtered on waterless hills. Panic seized the Crusader territories. Garrison commanders looked at their walls, counted their handful of soldiers, and understood they had no chance of resisting Saladin's veteran armies. Acre, the great port city and economic heart of the Crusader States, surrendered on July 10th, 1187, just 6 days after the battle. Acre was no minor outpost, but one of the most important cities in the eastern Mediterranean. Its harbour handled trade from across Europe, its markets were legendary for their wealth, and its fortifications had been strengthened over decades. But the garrison commander, Jocelyn III of Edessa, looked at his depleted defences. Most of his professional soldiers had died at Hattin, and recognised reality. Saladin offered generous terms. The garrison could leave with their possessions and personal weapons if they surrendered peacefully, and the city would not be sacked. Civilians could remain under Muslim rule or depart for Christian territories as they chose. Jocelyn accepted immediately. Saladin kept his word. When his troops entered Acre on July 10th, there was no massacre, no looting, no revenge, despite the fact that Acre had been in Crusader hands for nearly a century. The strategic calculation behind this mercy was brilliant. Every fortress commander in the kingdom learned immediately that surrender to Saladin meant survival and fair treatment. Every city that contemplated resistance understood they faced a choice. Open your gates and live, or resist and face the consequences of siege warfare. Most chose survival. The pattern repeated across the kingdom with stunning rapidity. Nablus surrendered without a fight on July 11th, its garrison commander recognizing that defending an inland city with no hope of relief was suicide. Tehran, a powerful fortress in southern Lebanon, capitulated on July 17th. Sidon, an important coastal city, surrendered on July 29th after token negotiations. Beirut, another major port, fell on August 6th. Jaffa, the vital port connecting Jerusalem to the sea and one of the oldest cities in the region, fell to Saladin's brother Al-Adil on July 31st after only brief resistance. The speed of the collapse was staggering and revealed the fundamental weakness of the Crusader States. They had always been military colonies, islands of Christian control in a Muslim sea, maintained only through constant military pressure and the divisions among their Muslim neighbours. The moment those divisions ended and a unified Muslim power emerged under competent leadership, the entire structure collapsed. The Crusader presence had been built on the military strength destroyed at Hattin, and without that army, there was nothing to hold the territories together. Ascalon, the fortress guarding the approach to Egypt and one of the most heavily fortified cities in the entire kingdom, held out longer than most. Its walls were massive, its garrison more substantial than other cities, and its strategic position meant Saladin could not simply bypass it without risk. The siege began in late August, and initially the defenders showed real determination to resist. But Saladin brought a weapon that broke their will prisoners. On September 4th, Saladin personally brought the captive King Guy and several captured Templar leaders to a position within sight of Ascalon's walls. He sent a message to the defenders: surrender immediately, or the prisoners would be executed before their eyes. It was psychological warfare of the cruelest sort. Guy was still technically the king, and many of the soldiers in Ascalon's garrison had sworn oaths of loyalty to him. Watching their king executed while they cowered behind walls would destroy whatever morale remained. The defenders negotiated surrender terms, the gates opened, and Ascalon fell without Saladin having to launch a single assault. By mid-September 1187, the entire kingdom of Jerusalem had effectively ceased to exist except for a handful of isolated fortresses. The transformation was almost incomprehensible in its speed. In early July, the kingdom had controlled a continuous territory stretching from Beirut in the north to Ascalon in the south, including all of the interior lands. By mid-September, barely 2 months later, virtually all of it was in Muslim hands. The only significant exception was Tyre. Tyre's survival was almost accidental. The great coastal fortress in the north, built on a peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean and considered nearly impregnable due to its position, was on the verge of surrender when Conrad of Montferrat arrived. Conrad was an Italian nobleman, a seasoned warrior and cunning politician who'd been travelling from Constantinople when he heard news of Hattin. He arrived at Tyre's harbour just as the city's leaders were negotiating surrender with Saladin's representatives. Conrad recognised immediately that Tyre's position made it defendable even against Saladin's entire army, as long as it could be resupplied by sea. He seized control of the city through a combination of personal charisma, military reputation, and the desperate gratitude of defenders who saw him as their salvation. Saladin besieged Tyre in November 1187, but this siege was half-hearted and ultimately unsuccessful. His army was exhausted from months of continuous campaigning. His siege equipment was not designed to attack a city that could be resupplied by sea, and Conrad proved to be an extremely capable defender, organising sorties that destroyed Saladin's siege engines and maintaining morale through his personal example of courage. After weeks of fruitless effort, Saladin lifted the siege in December, leaving Tyre as the only Crusader-held city in the entire region. Tyre's survival would have enormous consequences during the Third Crusade. It would serve as the beachhead for Richard the Lionheart's campaigns and the staging point for the eventual Crusader recovery of some coastal territories. But in September 1187, Tyre was isolated, surrounded, and seemed irrelevant compared to the ultimate prize that now lay exposed: Jerusalem. Saladin arrived before the walls of Jerusalem on September 20th, 1187, exactly 88 years after the first Crusade had captured the city in an orgy of massacre. The symbolism was not lost on anyone, and Saladin had likely chosen this date deliberately to emphasize the historical parallel. Inside the city, panic reigned. Refugees from across the kingdom had fled to Jerusalem as the only remaining sanctuary, and the population had swelled dramatically. Normally home to perhaps 30,000 inhabitants, Jerusalem now contained perhaps 60,000 or even more. Women, children, elderly, and the wounded vastly outnumbered fighting men. The military situation was desperate. The defence was organised by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few noblemen who had escaped Hattin. Balian had actually been at the battle, but had managed to break out during the final collapse, possibly with Raymond's group or through his own escape. He had only come to Jerusalem to evacuate his wife and children, intending to leave for Tyre immediately. But the desperate population, the Patriarch Heraclius, and the city's remaining leaders begged him to stay and organize the defense. Balian was released from his vow not to fight against Saladin. He had pledged his parole after Hattin in exchange for freedom to reach Jerusalem, because the situation was too desperate to honour such niceties. Balian faced an almost impossible task. He counted perhaps 60 knights in the entire city, noblemen or their sons who had not been at Hattin or who had escaped the disaster. Against Saladin's army of 20,000, 30,000 battle-hardened veterans, 60 knights were barely relevant. Balian took a dramatic step that showed both his desperation and his creativity. He knighted every noble boy of sufficient age, regardless of whether they had completed their training. Boys as young as 15 or 16, who in normal times would have served as squires for years before earning knighthood, were hastily dubbed knights and given armour and weapons. This ceremony created perhaps another 50-60 knights, though their combat effectiveness was questionable at best. He armed the civilian population, distributing whatever weapons could be found from the city's arsenals. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging spear points and arrowheads. Every man capable of holding a weapon was organised into militia units. Women and children were assigned to carry water and stones to defenders on the walls, to care for wounded, and to help repair damage from Saladin's siege engines. The Orthodox Christian population, which had often been at odds with the Latin Catholic rulers of Jerusalem, rallied to the defence because they understood that Muslim conquest would mean changes to their status as well. Balian also took steps to preserve order and prevent panic. He confiscated the treasures of churches and monasteries, melting down gold and silver ornaments to mint coins for paying soldiers. This was sacrilege in normal times, but the Patriarch Heraclius reluctantly agreed, because without money to pay defenders the city would fall within days. Balian imposed rationing of food supplies, recognising that a siege might last weeks or even months. He organised patrols to prevent looting and maintain discipline among the diverse, frightened population. Before attacking, Saladin offered terms, as was customary in medieval siege warfare. He sent envoys to the city promising that if Jerusalem surrendered peacefully, all inhabitants would be allowed to leave safely with their possessions. No one would be harmed. The holy sites, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish, would be preserved. It was an extraordinarily generous offer, especially given what the Crusaders had done to Jerusalem's Muslim and Jewish populations in 1099 when they captured the city. The First Crusade's conquest of Jerusalem had been one of the most horrific massacres of the medieval era. Contemporary chronicles describe the streets running ankle-deep with blood, civilians slaughtered by the thousands regardless of age or gender. The Jewish population burned alive when they took refuge in the main synagogue. The Temple Mount area, which included the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, became a charnel house where Crusader knights waded through corpses and blood to loot the buildings. The massacre continued for days, with estimates of the death toll ranging from 30,000 to 70,000 people. Every Muslim who survived was either enslaved or expelled from the city. Given that history, Saladin's offer to allow peaceful evacuation was remarkably merciful. But the city's leaders, particularly Patriarch Heraclius and the influential burgesses who represented Jerusalem's merchant class and Latin Catholic nobility, refused. They argued that surrendering Jerusalem without a fight would dishonour Christianity itself. The city had been lost before, during the early Islamic conquests in the 7th century, but it had been recovered through the blood and sacrifice of the First Crusade. To surrender it again without even attempting defence would be unforgivable. They would defend the holy city to the last, trusting that God would deliver them. There was also a more practical calculation behind the refusal. The defenders hoped that relief might come from Europe. Surely when news of Hattin reached the Christian kingdoms, massive armies would be raised to recover Jerusalem. If they could hold out long enough, perhaps relief would arrive. It was a desperate hope built on very optimistic assessments of how quickly European armies could be raised, equipped, transported across thousands of miles and deployed to Judea. In reality, any relief force was months or even years away. But desperate people convinced themselves of unlikely outcomes. Saladin's response was decisive and revealed both his military skill and his controlled anger at the refusal. On September 21st, his siege engines began bombarding the northern walls. Medieval siege engines, mangonels, trebuchets, and catapults of various designs hurled massive stones weighing hundreds of pounds at walls, trying to crack the masonry and create breaches. The bombardment was continuous, day and night, the crash of stones impacting walls providing a constant reminder of the city's peril. Simultaneously, Saladin's engineers began digging mines at the base of the walls, attempting to tunnel underneath the foundations and collapse sections through controlled underground fires. The defenders fought with desperate courage born of protecting families and holy sites. They launched sorties from the gates, sudden attacks by groups of knights and armed civilians who rushed out, attacked the Muslim siege equipment or mining operations, and then retreated back inside before being overwhelmed. Several of Saladin's catapults were destroyed this way, burned by defenders who risked their lives in suicide missions. These sorties inflicted significant casualties on the besiegers, and for 5 days, Saladin's assault made no significant progress. The northern walls were the strongest section of Jerusalem's defences, built on elevated ground and strengthened over decades of Crusader rule. After 5 days of assault with mounting losses and no breakthrough, Saladin made a tactical decision that revealed his strategic brilliance and his understanding of Jerusalem's history. On September 26th, he ordered his entire army to abandon the northern walls and relocate to the Mount of Olives on the eastern side of the city. This was the exact position from which the First Crusade had launched its successful assault in 1099. Saladin certainly knew this history and chose the location deliberately, both for its tactical advantages and for its symbolic power. The eastern walls were weaker than the northern defences, built on lower ground and less heavily fortified. More importantly, there were no gates nearby from which defenders could launch effective sorties against his siege equipment. His engineers and soldiers could work on mining the walls with less risk of sudden attacks. The new position was perfect from every perspective. Saladin's siege engines resumed their bombardment, now targeting a more vulnerable section of wall. His sappers went to work with renewed energy, digging tunnels under the eastern walls. Medieval mining involved digging a tunnel to a position directly beneath the wall's foundation, supporting the tunnel with wooden beams, filling the chamber with combustible materials, and then setting fire to it. When the wooden supports burned away, the tunnel collapsed, ideally bringing down the section of wall above it. It was dangerous, skilled work requiring experienced engineers and miners willing to risk cave-ins and suffocation in cramped tunnels. Within 3 days, Saladin's miners achieved what they came for. On September 29th, a section of wall approximately 30 meters long, roughly 100 feet, collapsed with a thunderous roar that must have been heard throughout the city. Dust and debris filled the air. When it settled, there was a massive breach in Jerusalem's eastern wall, a gap through which troops could pour directly into the city. Muslim soldiers immediately assaulted through the breach, shouting war cries, hoping to overwhelm the defenders before they could react. But the defenders, fighting with the fury of men protecting their families and their holy sites, threw them back in brutal hand-to-hand combat within the breach. Medieval breach fighting was among the most horrific forms of combat. The attackers had to climb over rubble and debris while being stabbed by spears and axes from above, shot by arrows and crossbow bolts from defenders on the intact walls on either side, and faced defenders who knew that if the breach was lost, the city was lost. The Christians repaired the breach as best they could during the night of September 29th, piling rubble, wooden beams, anything they could use to block the gap. But everyone inside Jerusalem understood the situation was now hopeless. The walls had been breached. Saladin's army could pour through at any moment. The repairs were temporary. Jerusalem could not be held. That night, Balian led what may have been a desperate sortie from the Jehoshaphat Gate, possibly targeting Saladin's command tent on the Mount of Olives in a last attempt to kill the Sultan and break the siege through decapitation. If they could kill Saladin, his coalition of Egyptian, Syrian and Mesopotamian forces might fracture as his subordinates fought over succession. It was a desperate gamble with almost no chance of success. The attack was easily repulsed by Saladin's guards and perimeter forces, and Balian understood there were no more options. No relief was coming. The walls could not be repaired. The defenders were exhausted. Continued resistance would only result in the city being taken by storm, which would mean massacre under the customs of medieval siege warfare. On September 30th, Balian approached Saladin under a flag of truce to negotiate surrender. What followed was one of the most dramatic confrontations of the medieval era, a negotiation that would determine the fate of tens of thousands of lives and shape how both Christians and Muslims remembered Saladin for centuries. The meeting took place in Saladin's command tent. Present were the Sultan, his senior emirs and religious advisors, Balian representing the Christian defenders, and interpreters to translate between Arabic and French. Saladin initially demanded unconditional surrender. The city would be taken by force, and its inhabitants would face whatever fate he decreed. By the laws of siege warfare that governed medieval conflict, this was entirely justified. A city that refused generous surrender terms and forced the attackers to conduct a costly siege and breach the walls forfeited any claim to mercy. Saladin had every legal and moral right, by the standards of his time, to sack Jerusalem, enslave its population, and exact revenge for the 1099 massacre. Balian countered with a horrifying threat that revealed the depths of desperation in the city. He stated clearly that if Saladin refused to offer terms, the defenders would destroy all the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem, particularly the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. These structures had survived Crusader occupation by being converted to Christian use. The Al-Aqsa became the headquarters of the Knights Templar. The Dome of the Rock had a cross placed on top, but they were still standing. Balian threatened to demolish them completely, to ensure that even if Saladin captured Jerusalem, he would capture ruins. The threat continued. The Christians would slaughter the 5,000 Muslim prisoners held in the city's dungeons, captives from various battles and raids over the preceding years. They would kill their own wives and children to spare them from slavery, preferring to send them to heaven as martyrs rather than allow them to be captured. They would burn every treasure, destroy every relic Christian and Muslim, and reduce Jerusalem to ashes and rubble. Then the remaining soldiers would launch a final suicidal assault on Saladin's army, selling their lives as dearly as possible and inflicting maximum casualties before being wiped out. The threat was credible and catastrophic. Balian was not bluffing. The population of Jerusalem was desperate enough to do exactly what he described. Saladin had not fought for 2 decades to unite the Muslim world, had not risked his life in countless battles, had not defeated the Crusaders at Hattin, all to see the third holiest site in Islam destroyed in the final moment of victory. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque were sacred to Muslims worldwide. Their destruction would be a disaster that would tarnish Saladin's victory and possibly turn his own supporters against him for allowing it to happen. Saladin consulted with his emirs and religious advisors. The debate in the tent was intense. Some argued for forcing entry and preventing the Christians from carrying out their threats through speed of conquest. Others pointed out that any assault would give the Christians time to start destroying the holy sites, and the moment flames were seen rising from the Dome of the Rock, it would be too late. After tense deliberation, Saladin agreed to accept a negotiated surrender on one condition. The inhabitants could leave Jerusalem alive, but they would have to pay ransom. The concept of ransom was fundamental to medieval warfare. Captured nobles paid ransoms based on their wealth and status. The same principle could apply to entire populations. After haggling that probably lasted hours, with Balian arguing the population was destitute, and Saladin insisting that Jerusalem's capture had to provide compensation for his army's efforts, terms were set. 10 dinars for each man, 5 dinars for each woman, and 2 dinars for each child. Those who could pay would go free with their possessions. Those who could not pay would become slaves. To understand the financial burden, a dinar was a gold coin of substantial value. 10 dinars might represent several months' wages for a skilled craftsman or a year's income for a poor farmer. For the wealthy merchants and nobility, it was manageable. For the poor, the refugees who had fled from captured cities with nothing, the labourers who lived hand to mouth, the women whose husbands had died at Hattin, it was impossible. Balian protested that most of the refugees who had swelled Jerusalem's population possessed nothing. They had fled their homes with only the clothes on their backs. The city's treasury had been emptied to pay for the military preparations after Hattin, weapons, hiring mercenaries, emergency food supplies. The mint had been running constantly, melting down church treasures to make coins, but most of that money had already been spent. How could tens of thousands of poor Christians possibly raise such ransoms? After more negotiation, Saladin agreed to a collective payment arrangement. 30,000 dinars would free 7,000 of the poorest inhabitants, the absolute destitute who had nothing. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers, the military orders that still had treasuries because they operated across all the Crusader States, agreed to contribute 10,000 dinars for this purpose. Balian contributed from his personal funds, though sources differ on the exact amount. But even these collective arrangements were not enough. The math was brutal. With perhaps 60,000 people in the city and only enough money to free a portion, thousands would inevitably be unable to pay. On October 2nd, 1107, Saladin's army entered Jerusalem peacefully, through gates opened by agreement rather than broken by force. The contrast with 1099 was deliberate and pointed. The city that had been taken by the Crusaders in a massacre that lasted days was recaptured without a single act of revenge killing. Saladin positioned himself as the merciful conqueror, the champion of civilization triumphing over barbarity, the embodiment of Islamic ideals of justice and mercy even toward enemies. For 40 days, a carefully organized evacuation proceeded. Those who had paid their ransoms left through the gates, heading for Christian territories, primarily Tyre, Antioch or coastal cities still in Christian hands. The evacuation was orderly, conducted under the supervision of Saladin's officers, who checked that each person leaving had either paid ransom or was part of the collective group freed through the bulk payments. Saladin posted guards along the roads leading from Jerusalem to protect the refugees from bandits, slave raiders, and opportunistic tribesmen who sought to prey on the columns of vulnerable civilians carrying whatever wealth they had left. Many of the richer inhabitants managed to smuggle out far more wealth than the surrender terms technically allowed. Wealthy merchants hid gold in clothing, concealed jewels in bread loaves, or bribed Saladin's guards to look the other way as they left with cartloads of possessions. Saladin knew this was happening. His intelligence network kept him informed, but he largely chose to turn a blind eye. His priority was getting the Christian population out of Jerusalem peacefully, so he could consolidate control and begin the restoration of Islamic administration. Enforcing the exact letter of the surrender terms to catch every instance of smuggling would have been petty and would have slowed the evacuation. But mercy had its limits, and the person who became the symbol of Christian hypocrisy in this moment was Patriarch Heraclius. As the religious leader of Latin Christians in Jerusalem, Heraclius had enormous moral authority. He also controlled vast wealth. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre's treasury contained gold vessels, jewelled relics, silk vestments embroidered with gold thread, silver candlesticks, precious manuscripts, and artwork accumulated over decades. When Heraclius prepared to leave Jerusalem, he paid his 10-dinar ransom and then loaded a caravan with treasures from the church, including items worth tens of thousands of dinars. As Heraclius's caravan left through the gates, laden with wealth, while thousands of poor Christians remained behind unable to pay their ransoms, both Muslim soldiers and poorer Christians looked on with disgust. Saladin's emirs came to him urging that Heraclius be stopped and the church treasures confiscated to ransom more poor Christians. Saladin refused, reportedly saying that he would not break his word. Heraclius had paid the ransom required, and the agreement said nothing about limiting what possessions freed individuals could take. This decision has been debated by historians. Some see it as Saladin displaying honourable commitment to keeping agreements even when strict enforcement would have been morally justified. Others see it as political calculation. Heraclius, for all his greed, was the patriarch, and treating him harshly would have given Christian propaganda a powerful symbol of Muslim cruelty. Whatever Saladin's reasoning, the image of the patriarch leaving with cartloads of treasure while thousands of poor Christians faced slavery became one of the most powerful propaganda tools Saladin could have asked for. It showed Christian leadership as greedy and hypocritical, concerned more with preserving material wealth than caring for their flock, when criticised by his own people for not using the church's wealth to ransom the poor. Heraclius reportedly argued the treasures belonged to God and could not be spent on mere people. This argument satisfied no one and destroyed whatever moral authority he had left. In Crusader chronicles written later, Heraclius is remembered as one of the villains of Jerusalem's fall, a man whose greed and moral bankruptcy epitomized the corruption that had doomed the kingdom. Saladin's response to the crisis of thousands of unpaid ransoms revealed the complexity of his character. He was furious at Heraclius's hypocrisy and moved by the suffering of poor Christian families being torn apart. But he was also bound by Islamic law, the customs of warfare, and his own promise that those who could not pay would become slaves. His solution was creative and showed both political brilliance and genuine mercy tempered by pragmatic limits. He granted 1,000 slaves to his brother Al-Adil as a gift, acknowledging al-Adil's crucial role in the capture of Jerusalem and the coastal cities. Al-Adil immediately freed them all, a grand gesture that brought him personal glory and demonstrated the mercy of Saladin's family. When Patriarch Heraclius saw this act of generosity and asked Saladin for slaves that he could then liberate himself, perhaps hoping to repair his damaged reputation, Saladin granted him 700. Heraclius freed them, though the gesture rang hollow, coming from a man who could have freed thousands using the church treasures he had smuggled out. Balian of Ibelin, who'd commanded the defence and earned Saladin's respect through his courage and pragmatic negotiations, received 500 captives as a gift, and he freed them all as well. Saladin then ordered that all elderly people who could not pay ransoms were to be released without payment and allowed to leave the city. Old men and women who would have been nearly worthless as slaves anyway gained freedom through this decree. The released elderly numbered in the hundreds, perhaps over 1,000. These acts of selective mercy freed several thousand people, but even Saladin's generosity could not save everyone. The math was inescapable. Several thousand poor Christians, exact numbers are disputed by sources with estimates ranging from 2,000 to 15,000, depending on the chronicle consulted, were sold into slavery. They were divided among Saladin's emirs and soldiers as spoils of war. Some were kept as domestic servants. Others were sold to slave markets in Damascus, Cairo, and other Muslim cities. The lucky ones were purchased by Christians who then freed them as acts of charity. The unlucky ones disappeared into lives of slavery that medieval sources do not document in detail. The transformation of Jerusalem began the moment Muslim control was established. The great cross that had topped the dome of the rock for 88 years was torn down on October 2nd as one of the first acts after the city's surrender. The cross was dragged through the streets, struck with sticks and whips, and eventually broken up and disposed of. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers describe crowds celebrating this symbolic restoration of Islamic dominance over the Temple Mount. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders had converted into a royal palace, and later into the headquarters of the Knights Templar, underwent ritual cleansing. Water brought from Damascus, regular water, according to most sources, though some chronicles mention rosewater as a particularly fragrant choice, was used to wash the floors, walls, and courtyards. The structures the Templars had built inside the mosque were torn out. Islamic inscriptions that had been covered or defaced were restored. Within days, the call to prayer rang out from the Temple Mount again for the first time in 88 years. Saladin ordered extensive repairs to the Islamic holy sites that had been damaged or modified during Christian rule. Skilled craftsmen were brought from across his empire to restore mosaics, repair stonework, and return the buildings to their original glory. The restoration work would continue for years, funded by Saladin's treasury and by endowments from wealthy Muslims who wanted to contribute to the restoration of Jerusalem's Islamic character. But Saladin did not destroy the Christian holy sites or expel all Christians. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred site in Christianity believed to be built on the location of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, was left intact. Saladin even allowed a small number of Orthodox Christian priests and Syrian Christian clergy to remain and maintain the shrines. This was both political calculation and genuine religious tolerance. Saladin understood that Jerusalem was holy to Christians and Jews as well as Muslims. Destroying their holy sites would turn this victory into a different kind of symbol, one of religious intolerance rather than Islamic triumph. The treatment of Jerusalem's Jewish population, though often overlooked in Christian chronicles, was significant. Jews had been banned from living in Jerusalem by the Crusaders after 1099. forced to live in surrounding areas and only allowed to visit during certain times. Saladin immediately revoked this ban, allowing Jews to return and settle in Jerusalem again. Jewish families from across the Muslim world, from Egypt, from Syria, from as far away as North Africa, began immigrating to Jerusalem in the months after its capture, seeing Saladin's conquest as an opportunity to return to their holy city after nearly a century of exclusion. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Europe that reverberated for years. News travelled slowly in the medieval world. The disaster at Hattin occurred in July 1187, but word did not reach Rome until late October. Pope Urban III, already elderly and in poor health, reportedly died on October 19, 1187, just days after hearing the news of Jerusalem's fall. Whether the news actually killed him, or whether the timing was coincidence, remains debated, but contemporary sources believed the shock of losing Jerusalem literally killed the Pope. His successor, Pope Gregory VIII, reigned for only 2 months, but used that time to issue a powerful papal bull calling for a new crusade. The bull, titled Audita Tremendi, portrayed the fall of Jerusalem as divine punishment for Christian sins and called on all Christian rulers to take up the cross and reclaim the holy city. The response across Europe was unprecedented. The Third Crusade would be the largest military expedition launched by Christian Europe since the First Crusade, led by the 3 most powerful rulers in Europe: Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, Philip II Augustus of France, and Richard III, Lionheart of England. But organising and deploying massive armies across thousands of miles would take years. Saladin knew this and did not wait. He continued his conquest throughout late 1187, 1188, and 1189, systematically reducing the remaining Crusader fortresses one by one. Safed, a powerful fortress controlling routes through Galilee, surrendered in December 1188. Belvoir, an impressive castle of the Knights Hospitaller, built on a mountain overlooking the Jordan Valley, held out until January 1189 before negotiating surrender. Queyrac, Reynald of Chatillon's infamous fortress where so much misery had begun, finally fell in November 1188 after a lengthy siege. Montreal, another massive fortress in the southern desert, held out until May 1189 before starvation forced its garrison to surrender. Dozens of smaller fortifications fell as well. By mid-1189, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land had been reduced to Tyre, the fortress of Crac des Chevaliers in northern Syria, the Principality of Antioch, weakened but still independent, and a handful of isolated castles in remote locations. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had seemed invincible just 3 years earlier, had been obliterated. Saladin's dream of uniting the Muslim world and liberating Jerusalem had been accomplished. He stood at the pinnacle of his power and prestige, ruling an empire stretching from Egypt to Mesopotamia, celebrated throughout the Muslim world as the champion who had achieved what no one had accomplished in nearly a century. Then the Third Crusade arrived, and Saladin faced the greatest challenge of his life. The first blow came in the summer of 1189 when Guy de Lusignan, who had been released from captivity after promising never to fight Saladin again, a promise he promptly broke, assembled a small army and laid siege to Acre. Guy had perhaps 7,000 troops, a pathetically small force compared to what Saladin could field. But his move was strategically brilliant. By besieging Acre, Guy forced Saladin to respond or lose credibility. Saladin brought his army and besieged the besiegers, surrounding Guy's forces and trapping them between his armies and Acre's walls. What began as what should have been a quick campaign to destroy Guy's small force turned into a 2-year siege that became a grinding war of attrition. Guy's forces were constantly reinforced by new Crusader arrivals from Europe. Small contingents of a few hundred knights here, 1,000 infantry there, steadily building up the besieging force. Saladin's army, which had been campaigning continuously since 1187, began suffering from exhaustion, disease, and declining morale. Emirs who had joined for the glory of capturing Jerusalem grew tired of endless siege warfare and wanted to return to their own territories. In 1191 the situation changed dramatically. Richard the Lionheart arrived with a massive English army, and Philip Augustus arrived with French forces. These were not scattered reinforcements, but full-scale royal armies numbering in the tens of thousands, fresh, well-equipped, and led by two of the most powerful kings in Europe. Acre fell to the Crusaders on July 12, 1191, a devastating blow to Saladin's prestige. The city that had been one of his first conquests after Hattin, captured with such promise in 1187, was back in Christian hands. The ransom negotiations that followed revealed the darker side of the Third Crusade. The terms for surrendering Acre included returning 1,600 Christian prisoners, paying a massive monetary ransom, and returning the true cross that had been captured at Hattin. Saladin attempted to negotiate, pointing out that gathering 600 prisoners from across his empire would take time, that some prisoners had been sold into slavery and would have to be located and purchased back, that the financial sum demanded was difficult to assemble quickly. He asked for more time to meet the terms. Richard the Lionheart, a very different kind of leader than Saladin, had no patience for delays. He was a warrior king whose military genius was matched by ruthless pragmatism. When Saladin was late in delivering the first installment of ransom, the sources disagree on whether he had actually violated the deadline or whether Richard was simply being impatient. Richard ordered all 2,700 Muslim prisoners from Acre marched outside the city walls. In full view of Saladin's army, watching helplessly from their positions a few miles away, Richard's troops executed every prisoner. Men, women, and children were slaughtered over several hours, while Saladin's forces watched, unable to intervene without breaking their own formation and exposing themselves to Richard's army. Saladin responded by massacring his Christian hostages in retaliation. The chivalry and mercy that had characterized the capture of Jerusalem 4 years earlier evaporated in the face of Richard's cold pragmatism. The Third Crusade became a war of mutual atrocity, where quarter was rarely given, and prisoners were often killed rather than being held for ransom. Both sides committed acts that would be called war crimes by any modern standard. Richard won a brilliant victory at the Battle of Arsuf on September 7, 1191, defeating Saladin's army in open battle. The clash showed Richard's tactical genius and personal courage. He led charges personally, smashed through Muslim lines, and forced Saladin to retreat. The myth of Muslim invincibility that Hattin had created was broken. Saladin's forces were not unbeatable, and Richard proved that a well-led Crusader army could still defeat them in the field. But Richard could not take Jerusalem. Twice he marched his army within sight of the Holy City, close enough that his soldiers could see the walls and towers. Twice he turned back without attacking. It was not cowardice, but strategic realism. Even if Richard captured Jerusalem through direct assault or siege, he recognized he lacked the resources to hold it permanently. His army would eventually have to return to Europe. Richard had political problems at home with his brother John scheming to seize the English throne. Philip Augustus had already returned to France and was threatening English territories there, and the Crusader force could not maintain a massive army in Judea indefinitely. Jerusalem, deep in the interior, could be surrounded and besieged by Muslim forces from all directions. supply lines would be constantly threatened. Saladin's empire remained intact despite the losses at Acre and Arsuf, and he could raise new armies from Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Richard understood that capturing Jerusalem would be a symbolic victory that would turn into a strategic disaster when he had to leave, and Saladin recaptured it immediately afterward. The Third Crusade ended in September 1192 with the Treaty of Jaffa, a compromise that satisfied no one but reflected military reality. The Crusaders retained control of a narrow strip of coastal cities from Tyre south to Jaffa. Richard renounced his claim to Jerusalem, acknowledging Muslim control over the Holy City and the interior territories. In exchange, Saladin guaranteed safe passage for Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem and the other holy sites, allowing them to worship at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre without interference. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was refounded, but as a shadow of its former self, reduced to a coastal strip without its namesake capital. Saladin had preserved his greatest conquest, but the cost was enormous. The strain of continuous warfare from 1187 through 1192, 5 years of almost constant campaigning, had broken his health. He was approximately 55 years old by 1192, elderly by medieval standards, and he had spent virtually his entire adult life on military campaigns. The stress of managing a fragile coalition of Muslim rulers who constantly schemed against each other, the physical toll of sleeping in military camps rather than palaces, the countless injuries from decades of combat, and the psychological burden of command had aged him beyond his years. Saladin suffered from what contemporary sources describe as fevers, weakness, and exhaustion. Modern historians speculate he may have contracted malaria, typhoid, or one of the other diseases that plagued medieval military camps. After signing the Treaty of Jaffa in September 1192, Saladin returned to Damascus, intending to rest and recover, but he never did recover. On March 4th, 1193, less than 6 months after the Treaty of Jaffa, Saladin died in Damascus. He was 55 or 56 years old, depending on which birth date is accepted. The cause of death was likely a combination of exhaustion, fever and illness contracted during the final campaigns. Contemporary Islamic sources describe his death as peaceful, surrounded by family and religious scholars, reciting prayers until his final moments. He died in the citadel of Damascus, the city where he had first established his power base nearly 20 years earlier. When his personal treasury was opened after his death to settle debts and distribute inheritance, it contained only 47 silver dirhams and a single gold coin. This detail became one of the most famous aspects of Saladin's legend. He had conquered an empire stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates, controlled some of the wealthiest cities in the medieval world, collected tribute and taxes from millions of subjects, and received a share of plunder from countless military victories. Yet he died with barely enough money to pay for his funeral. The explanation was simple. Saladin had given everything away. He distributed wealth constantly to his soldiers, ensuring their loyalty through generosity rather than fear. He gave lavishly to religious scholars, Sufi mystics, and the poor, building his reputation as a pious Muslim who cared more for the afterlife than for worldly wealth. He funded the construction of mosques, schools, hospitals, and other charitable institutions across his territories. He paid for the restoration of Jerusalem's Islamic sites from his personal funds. He maintained a lifestyle of relative simplicity despite ruling an empire, eschewing the elaborate luxuries that other medieval rulers indulged in. This generosity was partly genuine piety. Saladin was a devout Muslim who believed wealth was temporary and that charity earned divine favour. But it was also strategic brilliance. By giving away everything he captured, Saladin ensured his emirs and soldiers remained loyal. They followed him not because they feared punishment, but because they knew service to Saladin meant wealth and opportunity. His reputation for generosity also made it easier to recruit troops and convince rulers to join his cause. The Ayyubid Empire that Saladin had built through 2 decades of warfare and diplomacy began fracturing immediately after his death. His will attempted to divide the empire among his 3 sons, giving Egypt to Al-Aziz Uthman, Damascus to Al-Afdal, and Aleppo to Al-Zahir. But the division was unstable from the beginning. The 3 brothers immediately began competing for supremacy, each claiming to be the legitimate successor to their father's legacy. Other relatives, Saladin's brothers, nephews and cousins who governed various territories, pursued their own ambitions. Within years, the unified empire Saladin had created was splintering into the same kind of fractured collection of competing dynasties that had characterized the Muslim world before his rise. Al-Adil, Saladin's brother and most capable family member, eventually consolidated power and ruled as Sultan from 1200 to 1218, but even he could not maintain the unity Saladin had achieved. The Ayyubid dynasty would continue ruling various Middle Eastern territories until the 1250s, when the Mamluks overthrew them in Egypt. But the empire as a unified force was dead within a decade of Saladin's death. The divisions among Saladin's successors allowed the Crusaders to eventually reclaim some territories. During the 5th Crusade in the 1220s, they briefly captured Damietta in Egypt. The 6th Crusade, led by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, resulted in Jerusalem returning to Christian control from 1229 to 1244 through negotiation rather than warfare. The Muslims recaptured Jerusalem permanently in 1244, and it would remain under Muslim control until the 20th century, but the ease with which it changed hands multiple times after Saladin's death showed how his personal leadership had been essential to Muslim success. Yet despite the empire's fragmentation, Saladin's legacy transcended political failure. In the Muslim world, he became a symbol of resistance against foreign invasion and the champion who had restored Islamic dignity after the humiliation of the First Crusade. Every subsequent Muslim leader who faced Western colonialism or imperialism invoked Saladin's name. In the 20th century, Arab nationalists from Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser to Syria's Hafez al-Assad compared themselves to Saladin, presenting their struggles against Western powers as modern equivalents of his jihad against the Crusaders. Monuments to Saladin were erected across the Middle East. His tomb near the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus became a pilgrimage site. A massive equestrian statue of Saladin was erected in Damascus in 1993, on the 800th anniversary of his death. Schools, hospitals, streets, and institutions throughout the Muslim world bear his name. In popular culture, films, television series, and books portray him as the model Islamic hero. For Muslims, Saladin represents proof that Islam could triumph over overwhelming odds when united under righteous leadership. Even more remarkably, Saladin became a legend in Christian Europe despite being the enemy who recaptured Jerusalem. Medieval European writers, beginning within decades of his death, praised him as the model of chivalry, honour and nobility. The contrast between Saladin's merciful capture of Jerusalem and the Crusaders' 1099 massacre was impossible to ignore. Stories circulated about his generosity, his keeping of promises, his respect for worthy opponents. Dante Alighieri, writing his Divine Comedy in the early 1300s, placed Saladin in limbo, the first circle of hell reserved for virtuous non-Christians, alongside ancient philosophers and heroes. For a medieval Christian to honour a Muslim this way was almost unprecedented. Romantic literature of the medieval and Renaissance periods portrayed Saladin as a just ruler and worthy opponent who embodied knightly virtues better than many Christian kings. Stories, most of them fictional or heavily embellished, depicted him secretly admiring Christianity, showing mercy to Christian captives, and conducting himself with honour in all dealings. The historical reality was more complex, but the legend reflected a fundamental truth. Saladin had fought his wars with a code of honour that even his enemies could not help but admire. The reality of Saladin was more nuanced than the legend. He could be ruthless when necessary. He executed prisoners after Hattin, burned cities that resisted, eliminated political rivals without hesitation, and conducted warfare with the brutality that characterized the medieval era. His mercy was often strategic calculation rather than pure compassion. His famous generosity served political purposes by buying loyalty and building his reputation. He was a medieval warlord operating in a brutal age, not a modern humanitarian. But even acknowledging these limitations, Saladin genuinely stood apart from most of his contemporaries. He kept his word even when breaking it would have been advantageous. He showed mercy when vengeance would have been easier and more emotionally satisfying. He treated defeated enemies with respect rather than humiliation. He successfully united a fractured world not just through conquest, but through an ideal of Islamic solidarity that transcended tribal and dynastic divisions. He positioned himself as fighting for a cause larger than personal ambition, the liberation of Islam's holy sites from foreign occupation. At Hattin, Saladin achieved his masterpiece, a battle won not through superior numbers alone but through psychological manipulation, strategic patience, and tactical brilliance that turned the Crusaders' own weaknesses against them. In Jerusalem he demonstrated that conquest need not require massacre, that mercy could be a tool as powerful as the sword. In his death, he proved that power meant nothing compared to legacy, that a man who gave away everything could be richer in historical memory than kings who hoarded wealth. The Kurdish boy from Tikrit who had entered military service reluctantly became the Sultan who reshaped the medieval world. The general who survived multiple assassination attempts became the conqueror who reclaimed Islam's third holiest city. The leader who united Muslim territories from the Nile to the Euphrates became a legend that transcended religion, culture, and time itself. His story is a reminder that in the brutal theatre of medieval warfare, character mattered as much as strategy. That mercy could be a weapon as powerful as violence. That a leader who embodied ideals larger than himself could achieve what armies alone never could. Saladin crushed the Crusaders not just with military genius, but with the force of his personality, the strength of his convictions, and the power of the cause he represented. He was the Sultan who united Islam when unity seemed impossible, the warrior who defeated the Crusades' greatest army through patience and cunning, and the conqueror who reclaimed Jerusalem and showed that victory without vengeance was possible. His legacy endures because, despite all his flaws and contradictions, he represented something both Muslims and Christians recognized as noble. A man who fought for his faith with honor, who treated his enemies with dignity even in the moment of their defeat, and who understood that true greatness is measured not by what you take, but by what you give and how you are remembered when the sword is finally laid down. History remembers conquerors by what they destroy, and leaders by what they build. Saladin did both. He destroyed the Kingdom of Jerusalem, ended 88 years of Crusader occupation, and shattered the myth of Western invincibility in the East. But he also built something more lasting than any empire, a legacy of leadership that combined military brilliance with strategic mercy, ruthless pragmatism with genuine faith, political cunning with personal honour. He proved that unity was possible in a fractured world, that victory could be achieved without vengeance, and that a single leader with vision and will could reshape the destiny of civilizations. From his humble beginnings as a reluctant soldier dragged into his uncle's campaigns, through his rise to power in Egypt's treacherous political landscape, to his patient unification of Syria and Mesopotamia against rivals who preferred Christian alliances to Muslim solidarity, Saladin demonstrated that true power comes not from brutality, but from earning loyalty. At Hattin, he orchestrated the most devastating military victory of the Crusades era, destroying an entire kingdom in a single afternoon, not through superior numbers alone, but through understanding his enemies' weaknesses and turning their own divisions against them. In Jerusalem, he showed the world that a Muslim conqueror could demonstrate more mercy than the Christian knights who had massacred thousands in 1099 and in his death, leaving behind only a handful of coins despite ruling an empire. He proved that legacy matters more than wealth. The brutal truth of Saladin's story is that he succeeded where others failed, not because he was the most violent or the most ruthless, but because he understood that true power comes from inspiring loyalty, that lasting conquest requires justice as much as force, and that the greatest victories are won not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of both your followers and your enemies. He united a fractured Islamic world through a combination of military brilliance and political genius. He defeated the Crusaders not just with swords, but with strategy that made their own weaknesses his weapons, and he created a legend that has survived 800 years because even his enemies recognized in him something rare and worthy of respect. If this epic journey through Saladin's rise from obscure soldier to the Sultan who crushed the Crusaders and united Islam has shown you the brutal truth of medieval warfare and the power of strategic brilliance, then you need to support Wars in History on Patreon. Your support keeps this channel bringing you the real stories of history's greatest warriors, bloodiest battles, and most dramatic conquests. We don't do sanitized history. We show you the truth, the strategy, the brutality, the genius, and the consequences. Join our Patreon community and get exclusive content, early access to videos, behind-the-scenes research materials, and direct input on future topics. Link in the description. Become part of the Wars in History family and help us continue delivering the in-depth historical documentaries you can't find anywhere else. Thank you for watching this journey through Saladin's incredible story, and remember, history isn't just about what happened. It's about understanding why it still matters today. What these ancient battles teach us about strategy, leadership, and the human capacity for both brilliance and brutality. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep seeking the brutal truth.